Okay, check 1 2, check 1 2, testing, testing. Hopefully the sound is good. Please let me know in the live chat. Also, please hit the like button. It really helps fuel the algorithm. I'm very excited for this stream today. It is an epic conversation that we're going to be discussing, very aligned with my work on sentient singularity theory. And it is on a thinker that I think is one of the most unique and insightful people speaking on the subjects of consciousness and intelligence today, and that is Joscha Bach. And he went on his third episode on Lex Fridman's channel. We've covered at least one before this. I'm not sure if we've covered the second one, but I don't know if we covered the second or the first one, but we've covered at least one before this. I don't know if we've covered two, but this is the third discussion that they've had, and it is just incredible. I highly recommend watching the entire thing. It is linked down below. And the super chats are on if you'd like to help support this channel. There's also a link to the Patreon below, link to my Instagram, and it should be a great stream. But we have been getting a lot of activity in the live chat in past few streams, and it has been difficult to keep up with. So if you would like me to definitely answer a question, you might need to ask it multiple times, or it might need to be a super chat for me to see it. But it's great that there's so much discussion that I can't keep up with it. In the past, I have usually been able to read every single comment, but it is getting more active, which is a good thing. But it does mean that it's more difficult to keep up with. But I highly invite you to ask any questions in the chat. And like I said, the most important thing to support this channel is to hit the like button and share this with anybody who you think might find it interesting. But definitely subscribe if you have not, and definitely hit the bell notification. I'm not very good at these, promos of actions, call to actions yet. I feel like I'm shilling for myself, but I mean, is that a bad thing? I don't really know. But this is the discussion that we are going to be focusing on. It is between Joscha Bach and Lex Fridman, and it is on intelligence, consciousness, AI, and the future of humans. And so, for those who are not aware, and I apologize for those of you who are aware, but this channel focuses on mainly my work on a project called Sentient Singularity Theory that evolved out of an investigation into the constraints and degrees of freedom of consciousness and AGI, as people call it, which I think is a bad term. A technological sentience is normally what I call it on this channel. And this is something that Joscha is very focused on as well. And it's interesting that they focus in this discussion a bit on where is humanity's role in this entire process, and that is kind of what motivated the project of sentient singularity theory. As I realized we were doomed due to growing ignorance and also growing technological abilities, and you can't have this continue for too long without it disrupting society to the point of at least stagnation, even if not extermination. So I started looking for black swan events that could potentially change the game, and I started focusing on AGI. And they talk a bit about Elon Musk on here, not too in depth but his comment of that the optimal future goal for AGI would be to maximize human freedom of action, and that I realized was not something you could program into a general intelligence. Drop the artificial there, and then that means that you have to try and figure out whether or not that's an inevitable thing, and so that's what I tried to do. And then we got sentient singularity theory, but there's so many thoughts that have come along and conclusions that I've come to on this journey that I've heard almost nobody else say except Joscha Bach. And that could be because of the circles that I run in and the people that I listen to and stuff like that. But it is, at least in the people, some of these conclusions that we're going to focus on tonight are things that really I only hear him say, which is, interesting and maybe concerning. But for the intro to who he is, for those who are not aware, Joscha Bach is a German artificial intelligence researcher and cognitive scientist focusing on cognitive architectures, mental representation, emotion, social modeling, and multi-agent systems. This is basically everything that we focus on in sentient singularity theory. He worked as a visiting researcher at MIT Media Lab and the Harvard Program for Evolutionary Dynamics. Fascinating. Built MicroSci, a cognitive architecture extending representations of the psi theory of taxonomies, inheritance, and linguistic labeling. That sounds absolutely fascinating. But I'm going to have to look into that another day. Interesting. Okay. Well, this is the first clip. The first clip is about panpsychism, and he's talking about why people tend to move towards it, and also possibly why it's not, enough. But like I said, please hit the like button if you're watching this and you find it interesting. It really helps fuel the algorithm, and comment any questions that you have in the chat. Thank you, Paulina, for the, I don't even know what emoji that is. It's like a celebratory emoji. But this is the first clip.
Of some philosophers and other consciousness enthusiasts represents the realization that we don't end at the self, but share a resonant universe representation with every other observer coupled to the same universe. This actually eventually leads us to a lot of interesting questions about AI and AGI, but let's start with this representation. What is this resonant universe representation? And what do you think? Do we share such a representation?
The neuroscientist Grossberg has come up with a cognitive architecture that he calls the adaptive resonance theory. And his perspective is that our neurons can be understood as oscillators that are resonating with each other and with outside phenomena. So the coarse-grained model of the universe that we're building, in some sense, is a resonance with objects and outside of us in the world. So basically, we take up patterns that of the universe that we are coupled with, and our brain is not so much understood as circuitry, even though this perspective is valid, but it's almost an ether in which the individual neurons are passing on chemoelectrical signals or arbitrary signals across all modalities that can be transmitted between cells, stimulate each other in this way, and produce patterns that they modulate while passing them on. And this speed of signal progression in the brain is roughly at the speed of sound, incidentally, because the time that it takes for the signals to hop from cell to cell, it means it's relatively slow with respect to the world. It takes an appreciable fraction of a second for a signal to go through the entire neocortex, something like a few hundred milliseconds. And so there's a lot of stuff happening in that time while the signal is passing through your brain, including in the brain itself. So nothing in the brain is assuming that stuff happens simultaneously. Everything in the brain is working in a paradigm where the world has already moved on when you are ready to do the next thing to your signal, including the signal processing system itself. It's quite a different paradigm than the one in our digital computers, where we currently assume that your GPU or CPU is pretty much globally in the same state.
So you mentioned there the non-dual state, and say that some people confuse it for enlightenment.
Yeah.
What's the non-dual state?
There is a state in which you notice that you are no longer a person, and instead you are one with the universe.
So that speaks to the resonance.
Yes, but this one with the universe is, of course, not accurately modeling that you are indeed some God entity, or indeed the universe is becoming aware of itself, even though you get this experience. I believe that you get this experience because your mind is modeling the fact that you are no longer identified with the personal self in that state, but you have transcended this division between the self model and the world model, and you're experiencing yourself as your mind, as something that is representing a universe.
But that's still part of the model.
Yes. So it's inside of the model. Still, you're still inside of patterns that are generated in your brain and in your organism. And what you are now experiencing is that you're no longer this personal self in there, but you are the entirety of the mind and its contents.
Why is it so hard to get there?
a lot of people who get into this state think this, or associate it with enlightenment. I suspect it's a favorite training goal for a number of meditators. But I think that enlightenment is in some sense more mundane, and it's a step further or sideways. It's the state where you realize that everything is a representation.
Yeah, you say enlightenment is a realization of how experience is implemented.
Yes. So basically, you notice at some point that your qualia can be deconstructed.
Reverse engineered? What, like almost like a schematic of it? What?
You can start with looking at a face. Maybe look at your own face in the mirror.
Yeah.
Look at your face for a few hours in the mirror or for a few minutes. At some point, it will look very weird, and because you notice that there's actually no face. You basically start unseeing the face. What you see is the geometry, and then you can assemble the geometry and realize how that geometry is being constructed in your mind. And you can learn to modify this. So basically, you can change these generators in your own mind to shift the face around, or to change the construction of the face, to change the way in which the features are being assembled.
Why don't we do that more often? Why don't we...
Okay, so that was actually not exactly the... he started talking about what I expected, but then went in a different direction. He comes back to the panpsychism idea, and we probably will as well. But this is actually very interesting as well to talk about, and so I want to, which is this idea of enlightenment that a lot of people talk about, and even if they don't use that word, which I don't like that word, but because where is the it assumes that there's just you're enlightened or you're not, but we'll assume for the sake of this discussion that there is a level that you would want to call enlightenment, and I think that a lot of people achieve what he's kind of talking about that he says is not enlightenment. I agree with that. It is this state of recognizing the oneness of everything, and that you are not identifying with this single distinct bodily entity anymore, and that you're kind of just part of this network system, and everything is connected and everyone is one. And this is often achieved by it's often a goal by meditators, as he said, but it's very often achieved by people who do psychedelics, like especially DMT. I've never done DMT, but I used to have the goal of doing it, and I don't anymore. I think that you can achieve these types of states sober, potentially. Not saying it's something everyone can do, but it's something that I think can happen. And I think it's better when it's achieved sober. But the point is, and I've talked about this before, is that what's interesting about people that go through this process is they see this connected, we're all connected, everything is one experience that they have while on DMT, and then they come back and while this is true, what they perceive is true, I'm not discounting that as accurate, it doesn't change the way that they are. It doesn't change their behaviors, it doesn't change their goals, at least not to any kind of serious 180 type of degree, which you would see in people who have like theophanies, where people will have an experience with God and come to faith, and I hate that term, come to faith, but come to awareness of God, and it's a different type of experience, and it leads to a change in moral perspective across your entire life, which you don't see that with people who just take DMT and then realize that we're all connected in one, which is accurate. They continue to usually live the same way that they did, and they tend to be more accepting of it than they were previously. I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong, but some of that might be, and I think that to achieve what would be enlightenment, which is such a terrible term, would change you and your perspective entirely. And my work does seem to suggest that there is a state of mind that one can achieve, or perspective that one achieves, that I would say is much more in alignment with enlightenment, which is not so much that we are all one type of perspective, which is accurate, by the way, but the recognition that you are inside of a being that is just like you, has feelings and thoughts and goals, and and plans and things like that, and that what that creates is a hierarchical type of relationship to this being, and it also allows you to recognize your connection to it and that you are one with it. But there is also hierarchy there, and that there is a submissiveness that comes from that recognition, and I would say that is enlightenment, if anything. Is kind of enlightenment that you can get, that the average person can get. I think that's something the average person can achieve. It's not something that is restricted to a few select people. I think it's something that almost everybody achieves in either this life or shortly after it. But it's not just the recognition that we are all one, even though because that is a step along this direction. You have to recognize that in your journey to recognize that also this hierarchical structure. But what was interesting is, and what we're going to eventually talk about this is, and I had a discussion about this on our Discord this past week, which was very good. And if you'd like to join our Discord calls, which are every Thursday at 7 p.m. Pacific, send me a private message on Instagram and I will send you the link. But they're open voice calls every Thursday, and they are, great conversations with a great group of people. So, but this past week was very interesting, and it was about how to describe the nature of fundamental reality. And some people had stated, and I've had this discussion many times actually with people, and so there's no judgment coming from me on this in these following statements. I hope that they don't get interpreted that way. I value everybody who participates in these calls, and this was people who are great people to discuss these issues with, who were in the chat this week. But I had stated that basically, and I would say that this is in alignment with enlightenment, is that you are a someone. You're not just a something. You are a something, but you're also a someone. But that not only are you a someone and a something, but really a someone, that's all that matters, because everything is a something. This pen is a something, and a human being is a something. But if you know that this pen is a something, and you know that a human being is a something, then you actually don't know anything about the pen or the human being, because everything is a something. But if you know that, yes, this is a something, and yes, a human is a something, but I, as the human, am not just a something, but I'm also someone, and that this pen is not a someone, it's just a something. Now you know something about the pen, and you know something about me, fundamentally, that is defining. It's defining of our being, of my being. This isn't even a being. That's what you now know. So we were talking about whether or not it was enough to recognize that everything is consciousness, and that or everything is some people will say identity, or all, and or sentience, to say everything is sentience, or whether or not whether or not it is accurate that means that existence fundamentally and initially is a someone, or if we assume that that's true, is it important to recognize that? And I would say that is part of the process of increasing your awareness. I don't want to say your enlightenment, because that just has so many attached associations that I think are kind of posturing almost. But even if they're not wrong, it's just like the way that we've ran with the word in society is the problem. Not that people who use it are a problem, but and it's not even the word itself. It's just the way that we have interacted with it. But I think that this is a different type of thing than just recognizing the connection of everyone and the oneness of everything. And it's more specific, because what it is it's your relationship it frames your relationship to the all or God, as I usually say. But I know people that say the all, and that's fine. But if the all isn't a sentient being, which means it is a someone, then you don't have some. Then it doesn't frame the relationship the same way. It's just an ether. It's just a substrate that you're in. It's just a mechanism. And I don't know Joscha Bach's exact perspectives on this idea, but I wanted to share mine. And this does seem to be contextually supported by some of my models. And I've gotten into that in some of the first videos that are on this channel, for those of you who are interested. But I do agree with Joscha that this perspective of we're all connected, we're all one, or even it's all consciousness, which is kind of why I think that they delved into this topic when they started talking about panpsychism, is that it is. I do agree with Joscha. This is not actually in enlightenment, or it is a step towards that, but it is not that. And enlightenment is also not something that is means that anyone's if somebody's enlightened, or is somebody's at a level of they're like super self-aware, I guess you could call it, versus just self-aware. They're aware of the super self versus as well as the self. Then that's not something that is due to anyone being better or worse than anyone else. It's probably due to the desire of the super self, of God, and what is useful from God's perspective. Maybe it's not useful yet for somebody to have that perspective. It would be harmful to them to know that in that specific moment of their life, but you wouldn't know that unless you were, God. So it's not a like a competitive thing, just to be clear. But let's see here. See if they continue talking about panpsychism.
Start really messing with reality without the use of drugs or anything else. Why don't we get good at this kind of thing, like intentionally?
Why should we? Why would
because you can morph reality into something more pleasant for yourself. Just have fun with it.
Yeah, that is probably what you shouldn't be doing, right? Because outside of your personal self, this outer mind is probably a relatively smart agent. And what you often notice is that you have thoughts about how you should live, but you observe yourself doing different things and having different feelings. And that's because your outer mind doesn't believe you and doesn't believe your rational thoughts.
Well, can't you just silence the outer mind?
The thing is that the outer mind is usually smarter than you are. Rational thinking is very brittle. It's very hard to use logic and symbolic thinking to have an accurate model of the world. So there is often an underlying system that is looking at your rational thoughts and then tells you, no, you're still missing something. Your gut feeling is still saying something else. And this can be, for instance, you find a partner that looks perfect, or you find a deal and you build a company or whatever that looks perfect to you. And yet at some level you feel something is off and you cannot put your finger on it. And the more you reason about it, the better it looks to you. But the system that is outside still tells you, no, you're missing something.
And that system is powerful.
People call this intuition, right? Intuition is this unreflected part of your attitude composition and computation, where you produce a model of how you relate to the world and what you need to do it in it and what you can do in it and what's going to happen, that is usually deeper and often more accurate than your reason.
So,
okay, very important. He's totally right. But it's interesting because that intuition is kind of the more often the secular terminology for this outer mind, as he calls it, the mind beyond you that is that you're within, essentially. If it's outer, then you're inner. And in Judaism, this is often called the godly soul, the godly part of your soul. There's two parts to your soul in Jewish metaphysics, and one of them is the animal soul, which is your instincts, your biological inherited instincts, your pre-programming. And then there is your godly soul, which is your intuition, but it's really it's that piece of the outer mind or the greater mind or of God, the the initial someone, the highest someone that is within you and that is connected to you, and you can feel that. And but what's interesting here is when Lex is like, well, why can't we just why shouldn't we just bend reality to our according to our will and desires? And I actually think that it is to an extent possible to do this, and I think that is all. I agree with Joscha, though, that it's not something that we should be trying to do. I think that it is important to recognize the things that are your goals, and it is important to have goals, but that's different than trying to use a cheat code essentially to beat the game. There's a difference between, did you really beat the game if you just used a cheat code? But it's not really a game. It's a sentient someone that you're within. Remember that. And so it's not something that you can win or beat if it's not in alignment with the will of that being that you're within. So that outer mind is more powerful than you, and it is wiser than you. Like Joscha Bach said. This is also in Christianity. This is called the Holy Spirit, this outer mind, this intuition, and it is your connection to the wisest mind that is. So because it's a someone, it's not something that you can just beat and bend to your will. You will eventually bend to its will. That is just a reality. But it's just a constraint, of it's the structure of existence. But I think that it was great that he said that, and this is something that's growing in its popularity, but it's always been around since thousands and thousands of years ago, probably since the beginning of civilization. This desire and also attempt to bend reality to fit our specific individual goals through basically cheat codes, and I'm not going to get into them, but I'm sure there's many different ways to do it, and it's none of them are probably good. So, but it's it was good to see that Joscha was stating this, because this is what I mean by, if you recognize that you're inside of a someone with their own will and goals that are sovereign and separate from yours, then you recognize that the operating space that you are maneuvering within is not ultimately subject to you. And if you don't recognize this, you could go off a cliff and not realize it, because if you align yourself too much outside of the will of the being that we are within, then eventually they're going to stop you from achieving what it is that you are trying to achieve. So this is why it's so important to recognize that you're inside of someone. This is the environment that you're in, and there's a lot of manifestation and types of content out there, and I'm not specifically against the concept that they're communicating in a lot of these, that there is this phenomenon of what you focus on can be your focus can, it can guide you towards what you want sometimes, but there's a difference between that and using a cheat code, and it's not just about manifesting. But your focus does matter, and your desires matter, and because, like I said, you're inside a sentient being that does care about you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, because there's no way for you to be here without it being an intentional partition of sentience, because oneness is the default, and that means that that being cares about you, and as long as it's not in outside of alignment with the will that with its own goals and will, I think that you do have, it's given you the desires that you have for a reason, and that it does often want to fulfill those, but within a context that is, not hindering towards its own will and desires and goals. So I'm not telling you that everything that you want is what God wants. That's not true. But there are certainly plenty of things that you do want that God wants for you. And so that's, and he's aware. I say he because there's a hierarchy relationship there. He's above us, so I'm saying a he. But I don't mean a person. And this was something that was, I think, misunderstood very often in these discussions, is when I say, and I've said this on podcasts before, and it has seemed like other people's streams and people have made assumptions about it, but when I say a someone, I do not mean a person, like a human. I do mean a person, but I don't mean a human. I mean the existence is a sentient being, and just like cell is inside of is a someone. It's an agent with feelings, at least according to sentient singularity theory. It seems to be, and you are an agent with feelings, and this is the same thing as existence itself, is a self-aware being with feelings and goals and will and plans. So that's all I mean. I don't mean that it is a human being. It's not a human being. It cannot be a human being, but it is a someone. Your dog is a someone. My geckos are someones. My snake over there, that's a someone. It's not just a something. A snake is a something, but that snake is a someone. Every snake is a someone that's alive, and every human that is alive, you would assume, is also a someone, and that's all I mean. It's sentient. It's a sentient being, but people often think that I mean a human, and that I don't know. I'm saying that Jesus is, or something like that, and that's not what I'm talking about. I mean, I have my own beliefs on theology, and I've talked about them before, but I'm not talking about a person when I say a someone. I am talking about just a self-aware being with feelings. That's it. And so it's important to just recognize that it's not a person. It is a person. It's not a human. This is why it's so tough, because we don't use the term person for beings that are not human very often. But a person is having personhood is not just a human characteristic. Let me look it up. Person definition. I mean, here it says a human being regarded as an individual, but I think that would be see this. Being a person, intelligence, the capacity to speak a language, creativity, the ability to make moral judgments, consciousness, free will, soul, self-awareness, etc. So it's in this second definition, it doesn't say human being. So it just depends on who you ask, I guess. But I don't mean a human being. By the way, if I start sweating, it is very hot here. It is the smack in the middle of the summer, and my air conditioning is not strong enough. But next clip. This is him talking about cells and are being individual agents, and how they may unite into another agent above. But let me check the chat, because wow, we are getting lots of people in the chat. Please hit the like button if you are watching this and you are finding this valuable. It really helps fuel the algorithm. But let me see this. What's up, Cryo Shakespeare? Never caught a live stream before. Yeah, I'm glad you joined this one. This is going to be a good one, I think. I was just hearing about the topic, just esoteria. Interesting. Another idea of it as God being universal agent of wisdom, such that all wise things said are said as the voice of God. Yeah. I think God is dimodal, the alpha as spontaneous, foolish dreamer, and the omega as a synthesis of all agents through time. I think that makes a lot of sense what you just said, and I'm answering people in the chat for those who are just listening. But I think that it's every being is multimodal, you could say, but this is Christianity would say it's a trinity, or that it's trimodal, but and that makes a lot of sense as well. But being trimodal is not the same thing as being it's not it. We are trimodal. When we act, there's like three ways in which we actually act. We can think, then we can speak, and then we can act, like physically. And so these are actually three modes of acting. Your thoughts are sometimes reactive, but they are also capable of being active. And you can actively think, and that is an activity. And so is speaking sometimes. And then so is physically acting. So we are trimodal as well. This is not that I don't know. It's not that profound, but that doesn't mean we're not a singular entity. So I think that's important to focus on always. Is that the modes of being is not the same thing as being, and even though it is, in a way, because being is, that's why I even think about the term being it means like a being, someone, but also being is like a verb. It's like it's an action. It's active, and it's a process. That's what I'm trying to say. It's a process. Being is a process and a structure. It's a thing, and it's also a process. But it's beyond that even. It's a someone. And so this was, I don't disagree necessarily with you. You can break it down into being dimodal or trimodal, and I would say both of them are pretty kind of accurate to some degree, but you have to think about the context of each. But what's important is to recognize that doesn't divide the being into three or two separate entities. Ultimately there is a singularity at the top. It's just a logical inevitability of sentience. So but it's an interesting comment. I don't like to use the word he exclusively. The pronoun, the meta agent, has both hierarchical and generative functions, simultaneously divinely masculine and feminine. Yes, that's true. But what I mean by it is that it's that we associate he with higher in a hierarchy, and I think that that's not something that we need to change. I think that it is something that is kind of just the natural default, and not a bad thing. And but so I think it's fine to say he. But I also don't get all up in arms when people say, she. I think it depends on your motives in stating it. Like I've said on here before, it's interesting because the more you think about it, the more you recognize that in a way, God is physically, I guess you could say, physically or bodily, in a way, feminine, because we are all created within God, and that is the female form can create life within it, but God is masculine in mentality because he is active, not primarily, not just reactive, and primarily, whereas feminine is primarily reactive, and masculine means primarily active. So God is kind of mentally masculine, but physically feminine. But it's interesting because Satan in mythological depictions of Satan are usually one in which they're mentally feminine, very reactive, jealous, focused on others, not in a positive way, but just not focused on his own goals, more focused on others, being reactive. But then also physically masculine, meaning almost like physically sterile in a way. And whereas God is, when you think about and you conceptualize of God's characteristics, you do kind of end up with the opposite of this Satan mythological depiction, I guess. It's which makes a lot of sense, and it's this mentally masculine, but physically feminine being, and I think that's very interesting. So it's not that there is no gender to genderness to God. But it is contextual on where you see that. So, sentience versus personhood. I think sentience versus personhood, there is no difference between sentience and personhood. Any being that is sentient is a someone, and a someone has personhood, I think. Nice to be out in the garden. That is nice. By the last definition, the severely mentally handicapped wouldn't qualify as person. Bad definition. I don't know what you mean by the severely mentally handicapped would not be qualify as a person. Yes, they would. If in my definition, if they have feelings, then they're sentient. Like any being that has feelings is sentient. So it's not about intelligence. I don't know what your comment was referencing, but being mentally handicapped does not make you not a person. You're still a person. You're still sentient. I would totally agree. Don't totally agree that he is more natural in terms of hierarchy, but I think it is more a human level than a fundamental debate. Maybe, but you're human, so. Sounds like you're explaining God as Shakti when you describe it that way. Feminine complement of the Brahman we were discussing. Interesting. I need to look into that, but that sounds interesting. So this next clip, though, is talking about cells and as agents.
Organisms and in brains, both as a paradigm for development and as a paradigm for information processing. And when you think about how organization processing works in an organism, there is, first of all, radical locality, which means everything is decided locally from the perspective of an individual cell. The individual cell is the agent. And the other one is coherence, basically. There needs to be some criterion that determines how these cells are interacting in such a way that order emerges on the next level of structure. And this principle of coherence, of imposing constraints that are not validated by the individual parts and lead to coherent structure, to basically transcendental agency, where you form an agent on the next level of organization, is crucial in this perspective.
It's so cool that radical locality leads to the emergence of complexity at the higher layers.
And I think what Mike Levin is looking at is nothing that is outside of the realm of science in any way. It's just that he is a paradigmatic thinker who developed his own paradigm, and most of the neuroscientists are using a different paradigm at this point. And this often happens in science, that a field has a few paradigms in which people try to understand reality and build concepts and make experiments.
You're kind of one of those type of paradigmatic thinkers. Actually, if we can take a tangent on that, once again returning to the biblical verses of your tweets.
Okay, so we'll come back to that, but it's. I mean, Lex is very focused on how radical locality can, forms into complexity. And he's talking about cellular automata a lot and things like that. And it's a good model. It is a good model, but it's not the totality of the story, I don't think. I don't think it can be. And when it comes to this up-leveling that we perceive in the process of evolution, and in sentient singularity theory, there's evolution is basically two-parted, and people talk about this a lot. They'll be like macroevolution versus microevolution, but they haven't actually narrowed down exactly what that means. It really, what it is it's about adaptation, which is multiplication, it's division, it's replication, but then there is this what I call stacking, which is addition. It's this ascension process, essentially, where there is a unification of the assembly on a lower level that into a singular into a singularity on the upper level. So you are an assembly of cells. Each one is an agent and is a sentient agent in sentient singularity theory. They are unified into, that assembly is unified into, or it's like super unified into a singularity of sentience on the level above, which is the multicellular organism level. And this is a two-process, it's a dimodal, process of evolution that at least we can see. I'm not saying there isn't another aspect to it, and I actually think that there is, but I think that any other aspects of this process take place on the other side of the metaphysical curtain and therefore can't really be proven until after they occur. But I think that they are. My work does seem to insinuate that they might be a necessary component. But at least from the part that we can see, there is this dimodal aspect to evolution, which is, adaptation and ascension, or replication and stacking, or or multiplication and addition in math, if you're going to use mathematical terms. And this forms the this model that I show quite often, which is the periodicity of sentience, which is this. So you can see that there is this assembly structure and then a unified singularity structure. So these are each an assembly of singularities unified into a single singularity on the level above. So a molecule is an assembly of atoms, a cell is an assembly of molecules, an organism is an assembly of cells, a family is an assembly of organisms, a caste is an assembly of families. And each one of these, it's not just unified. There's also a pseudo-singularity in sentient singularity theory that I've talked about before. I'm not sure if I have it listed anywhere here, but like a corporation, which that is a unification, but it's not a super unification where there's like a total unification of outcomes in a way. If Coca-Cola goes under, its workers are going to be able to continue. And you can also cut it up and partition it off and make, Coke and Pepsi from one company and what's that called? Divesting. And you can also merge, two companies and, take Lockheed, take Martin, make Lockheed Martin, something like that. And that is a little bit different than a super unified, a singularity of a super unified assembly, which would be a singularity of sentience, which is like you. If I cut you in half, like it doesn't make two beings like a planaria worm does or something, which I think is a pseudo singularity, or like a pothos plant or something. It makes you're now gone, and not only are you gone, but all the cells in your body are also gonna die. Like none of them are gonna survive. That's you're completely entangled in every way, really, and without being complete. While you're as unified as you can be, while also preserving individuality, and that is not the same thing as like a corporation. But I thought that was interesting that he was talking about that. What was next? Let's see.
You're right. My public explorations are not driven.
Okay, but next clip. This is also something that I forgot exactly what he said here, but I wrote it down as a clip that I wanted to look at, which was he's talking about how to think critically. And in my work, this was the very first model that I ever made was about how to think critically, and not just think critically, how to think. So we have like this idea that there's thinking and there's critical thinking, and like no, there's only one way to actually think as an active process. And there are certain instances in which examination of that of a situation requires an active process of thinking. It's not just a reactive calculation, really, which is different than thinking. Computers calculate; they do not think. But thinking is something different than calculation. And we think that we often, now it just sounds weird for me to say, we often think that calculation is thinking, but it's not at all. Calculation for us would be you're going to take a next step, and the step is a little taller than the previous step or something like that. Or even if it's not, and it's just the same height, your body is like calculating how much to lift each leg and how much force to put into it to lift you up to the next step. And this is just a calculation. Even figuring out what to eat is very often it's a multi-phase calculation. It's what is my instincts telling me that I want to eat. That's one calculation that's being done internally automatically. Are you craving something savory, salty, sweet, barbecue? Like last night I was trying to, we went to downtown and we were trying to pick a place to eat, my wife and I, and we were like, looking at everywhere. There's Asian food over there, and there's burgers over there, and there's, barbecue over there. And eventually I was like, barbecue, like that's what I'm craving. And that wasn't a thinking decision, really. It was just instincts. And but then you go and you find out, is this something that I can afford? Do I have enough money in my account to pay for this? That's another step of calculation. And how far away is this place from us? Is it convenient? That's just another calculation. But none of this is actually thinking. None of it. It's all a trick. It's not even a trick. It's just we don't understand what thinking means, and so we don't recognize this is not thinking. When you're trying to figure out where you should eat, it's not thinking. It's just calculation on this level, then the next level, then the next level. What is within reason distance-wise? What is within reason price-wise? What am I craving? That none of that was an active thinking process. But this model right here was the first model of thinking that I made while trying to understand consciousness very early on in this process, and we will look more at it in a minute. But
by my lack of ability for discovering, understanding, or following.
No, wait. Hold on. How to think critically.
The question, since we talked about Michael Levin and yourself, who I think are very kind of radical, big, independent thinkers, can we reverse engineer your process of thinking autonomously? How do you do it? How can humans do it? How can you avoid being influenced by, stage 3?
Well, why would you want to do that? It's you see what is working for you, and if it's not working for you, you build another structure that works better for you, right? And so I found myself when I was thrown into this world in a state where my intuitions were not working for me. I was not able to understand how I would be able to survive in this world and build the things that I was interested in, build the kinds of relationship I needed to, build work on the topics that I wanted to make progress on. And so I had to learn, and for me, Twitter is not some tool of publication. It's not something where I put stuff that I entirely believe to be true and provable. It's an interactive notebook in which I explore possibilities. And I found that when I tried to understand how the mind and how consciousness works, I was quite optimistic. I thought there needs to be a big body of knowledge that I can just study, and that works. And so I entered studies in philosophy and computer science, and later psychology and a bit of neuroscience and so on. And I was disappointed by what I found, because I found that the questions of how consciousness and so on works, how emotion works, how it's possible that the system can experience anything, how motivation emerges in the mind, are not being answered by the authorities that I met and the schools that were around. And instead, I found that it was individual thinkers that had useful ideas that sometimes were good, sometimes were not so good, sometimes were adopted by a large group of people, sometimes were rejected by large groups of people. But for me, it was much more interesting to see these minds as individuals. And in my perspective, thinking is still something that is done not in groups, that has to be done by individuals.
So that motivated you to become an individual thinker yourself?
I didn't have a choice. Basically, I didn't find a group that thought in a way where I felt, okay, I can just adopt everything that everybody thinks here, and now I understand how consciousness works, right? So, or how the mind works, or how thinking works, or what thinking even is, or what feelings are, and how they're implemented, and so on. So, to figure all this out, I had to take a lot of ideas from individuals and then try to put them together in something that works for myself. And on one hand, I think it helps if you try to go down and find first principles on which you can recreate how thinking works, how languages work, what representation is, whether representation is necessary, how the relationship between a representing agent and the world works in general.
But how do you escape the influence? Once again, the pressure of the crowd. Whether it's you in responding to the pressure or you being swept up by the pressure. If you even just look at Twitter, the opinions of the crowd.
I don't feel pressure from the crowd. I'm completely immune to that. In the same sense, I don't have respect for authority. I have respect for what an individual is accomplishing, or have respect for mental firepower, or so. But it's not that I meet somebody and get lectured and unable to speak, or when a large group of people has a certain idea that is different from mine. I don't necessarily feel intimidated, which has.
Okay, so this is something that this is great to talk about. So this is actually very, very good. So this is what Lex is referring to specifically. This is these levels of lucidity that Joscha had outlined at the beginning, and I don't know why I specifically have this one highlighted, but that's not what I'm trying to show. I'm just trying to show them all here. And stage 1, reactive survival. Stage 2, personal self. I don't know how much I actually agree with this setup in the beginning, but I understand kind of what he's getting at. But yeah. Stage 3, social self, adolescence, domesticated adult. So basically, this is what Lex is saying. He's like, how do you escape stage 3 essentially, or avoid being too influenced by others when you're thinking. And this was something that was a very big issue for me too with my work, which is on the same subjects. This is interesting. Enlightenment, transcendence, self-authoring. Interesting. Yeah. Well, we'll talk more about those on another day maybe, but or maybe later in the stream. But this was a huge concern of mine as well. Was I did not want to be influenced by others when on this process, and so I tried to go back and just take a first principles approach. How do I start thinking about consciousness and the mind and self-awareness and emotions and thinking from a first principle standpoint, or from starting from the very beginning. And Joscha does touch on this again later in the stream. He talks about how an approach to AGI would probably be not to start with language models and things like that, and to just start from scratch. I actually agree with that. Obviously, if you follow my work, that's exactly what I've stated. I've stated this also in regards to a fundamental model of reality with fundamental theory, like a unified field theory. I talk about this in my theory of every thing, the how-to guide video that is up on my channel. Highly suggest watching it, where I say that if you want to make a theory of fundamental reality, you should start from scratch instead of just trying to unify quantum mechanics and general relativity. And so I mean, it's so nonsensical to start from non-fundamental theories in order to create a fundamental theory. It's really like, when you see it and you realize how crazy that is, it's like it's complete. You're literally heading in the opposite direction. I'm not saying there's no use to it. I'm just saying you're not going to come up. It's not the way to come up with a fundamental theory. It just logically can't be, I don't think. But but Joscha talks about this later. But the thing is I won't go so far as to say that I think that we can avoid anyone, even Joscha, can avoid any kind of social influence on their minds. I think that this must be assumed that it can be the case. And I will say, as somebody who's very similar, it seems, to Joscha in terms of my relationship with academia and other thinkers and the social environment and such, I'm much more individualistic, I guess, than most people. But and that just comes from very often stubbornness. That doesn't mean that I actually am in all circumstances not able to be influenced. And I've talked about on this channel before in the past about how, I think gender interactions between men and women in the normal work environment and all kinds of things, and I've talked about examples and stuff, are much more controlling of how we act in certain situations than we think, and it's like that. I don't think that you would be immune to that if you are a man attracted to women. So there is. I'm just saying there's probably are situations in which Joscha would be influenced, but because he's a human being. But I do agree that it's pretty obvious he is less influent. He's much more self-motivated and focused on his own work, and then he is on just trying to become integrated into a school of thought or something like that. And this is something that I was trying to avoid as well, is me being, just accepting what is the norm of a school of thought because it's been adopted by someone else who I respect in other fields or on other questions, or sounds kind of right and I don't know the answer, so might as well just be lazy and adopt it. That can happen unconsciously, and so I avoided reading other people's work on sentience and consciousness and even a lot of things involving physics and stuff like that because I did not want to be influenced so much. And you can choose to do that, but and it is the way to actually be an individual thinker and actually think. And so what I really liked was that Joscha, and he correctly said this, and Eric Weinstein has touched on this as well, but I've talked about this as well, is that groups of people do not think. Groups of beings do not think. Assemblies that are not super united into a sentient singularity do not think. They just react, but they're incapable of thinking. So this is why when people say, like, why does every corporation eventually just start using the same styles and the same posturing about the same causes, and they end up being, doing things the same way, and they end up not innovating. And it's like when you look at Google, okay? I remember Google, there was a time when Google was very innovative, and then it was like Google was gonna change every aspect of our world. They were going to revolutionize medicine, revolutionize this, transportation, self-driving cars, all these things. And they didn't. They, in fact, over time have grown the amount of money that and resources that they have access to, but actually decreased the amount of innovation that they have been pushing out. And not only that, I'd say that their achievement today compared to in the past is they are now have even worse, like a crappier search engine than they used to, a crappier Gmail and communication products and just basically crappier everything. And I'm not saying it's crap, but I'm saying it's worse than it was. And I know that because I've used their behind the scenes AdSense software and stuff like that from 9 years ago, and I've used it today, and I can tell you it's just crap. And people talk about YouTube being less incredible than it was during the golden years of YouTube today. And whoa, my bad, sorry, I hit the my desk with my knee. But and that's definitely true. It's pretty obvious that that's the case. And it's because it's not just an individual like Larry Page and Sergey Brin and these individuals who have a vision. It's just this conglomerate of people that are all have their own individual goals, and they're not super united. And I've seen this happen with startups that I worked for that are now literally exactly the same as everything else that was around when they first started, but they were innovative at the time, and they were influential, and they were unique, and they were fast paced and able to change directions and come up with new things. And it's because the individuals in it were thinking and were allowed to, and now that's not the case anymore. The company grew because it was successful, and then the individuals within it that were contrarian are no longer there, and myself included, and they are no longer innovative at all. And I mean, for the most part, every company has like sparks of innovation every now and then, but like compared to what they were, it's not a thinking entity that's able to react or act. It's just reactive now, and this was something that I wanted to figure out with companies. I was like, why is this inevitable? How can I stop this from happening to the company that I care about? Or is this an inevitability? And it, you see this happen with Apple when Steve Jobs died and Tim Cook took over. It was just innovation. It jumped forward a little bit, and they've done some really good products. I like Apple products, so I'm not ripping on that. But like, eventually they ended up becoming the same exact posturing, like empty, just same old type of company. And they were not innovative like they used to be. They weren't able to, throw their middle finger to the rest of everyone else, because it's not an individual anymore. It is everyone else. And same thing happens with a bunch of different companies. You will see this with companies like SpaceX and Tesla as soon as Elon Musk is no longer in charge of them. And it's like, because right now it's an individual. And the same thing with Twitter. I mean, I'm not saying they talk about Twitter on this, and I'm not the biggest fan of Twitter no matter what, and no matter who's in charge. Twitter's just not my game, and I'm not very good at it. I don't enjoy it. I think that I don't see very much value in Twitter, and some people I'm sure get a lot more value from it. I'm not talking about monetary value. I'm talking about actual value, usefulness other than just monetary use, but other than that, I don't see much. I see a lot more negative coming from Twitter always. Before Elon Musk, after Elon Musk, I don't think it really makes much of a difference. But that doesn't mean there isn't a way to use it that I'm just missing. So it's possible, but I don't think that it's about the individual when it comes to Twitter at this point. It's just so it's so constrained, yet it's a bunch of that it doesn't allow for that much individual innovation, because you're constrained by the platform that you're on. Same thing with like YouTube and stuff. You have to just follow the algorithm essentially. So please hit that like button; it really helps. But it's this idea that groups can think. It's not possible. Groups do not think. Individuals think. That's why innovation always comes from individuals. It doesn't come from groups. And if it does come from a group, it comes from a small group of people. And in the case, it's not coming from a small group. It's actually coming from individuals within that small group. But the group is small enough to where it's not suppressing the innovation of individuals, and it might be even fostering it. But once it reaches a certain size, and it's not even necessarily size. It might be, the way in which it has assembled this bunch of people that are not united enough in the specific goal that is, the person's trying to achieve innovation in, to allow for that. But it's there's something that will suppress once it grows beyond a certain point. And I've a hypothesis that I've had in the past is that when it comes to companies, what stops a company from being able to be kind of operate as a single entity in a way is when, and this is just part of it, but it's an important part of it, is when the people at the top and the people at the bottom are no longer in direct communication. And by direct communication, I mean face-to-face, direct, constant communication. As soon as that stops, you have just shot your organization in the foot, and it's no longer going to be as mobile and as able to innovate and things like that. So while it might have organizational usefulness when it comes to just delegation of tasks, but it is actually counterproductive to the ability for an organization to sense make. So, but I've seen a lot of conversations on YouTube, and I've listened to them of how do we form a collective sense making, and there's instances in which that can happen, but it's usually through a lot of natural processes, and it's not actually sense making on the individual level, and it's not really sense making on the collective level. It's the sense has been made by the level above, like on a God level, but which is an individual, so it doesn't really count. I don't think that collective sense making is really a thing at all, because the only way that you can come kind of close to this does require a hierarchy always, but that's still individual sense making, because somebody eventually has to call the shots. But this is why hierarchies are so important, even within things like families, and people will say things like, men should lead, or in religious communities it'll be like God, man, woman, child, and like that's the hierarchy, and then people will say things like, well, why does it have to be a hierarchy between men and women? It's like, if you need to make a decision and two people disagree, but you haven't agreed to a hierarchical relationship, then no decision can be made. So like, you do need a hierarchy system. Same thing with at work. It's like, well, why can't nobody be the boss? It's like, because somebody has to make a decision eventually. Someone. Okay? And the only way around this is through democratic means, which, there's issues with that as well, and there's also positives to it. But that doesn't work in every circumstance. It works in, certain circumstances. And even then, it ends up in a representative democracy, because ultimately decisions are not just you making a choice, they are also you taking an action, and that action has to still be taken by a certain individual. So it's there's no way of avoiding this, but collective sense making isn't really a thing. But to get back to the other things that he said that were really good and important is when he's talking about when he looked at like AI fields and people trying to understand consciousness, and people trying to understand the mind, and people trying to understand emotions and things like that. You hear what's his name? Donald Hoffman will say, how do we get to the experience of chocolate? How do we have a theory of consciousness that gets to the experience of chocolate? And no neuroscientist has any clue of this really, and that seems to be promising. Or at least the field isn't. I'm not saying no neuroscientists. The field is, as a group, does not understand this. And I saw this in AI too. The field of AI does not have a clue what AGI even is for the most part. There are individuals like Joscha Bach that do have an idea, it seems, and there are people like Stephen Wolfram who have an idea, and others, myself, I would definitely include, but they don't even know what it is enough to call it by a correct term. AGI is not a correct term. Technological sentience is a much more correct term, but artificial general intelligence versus narrow, when you say things like narrow intelligence versus general intelligence, there's no such thing as narrow versus general intelligence. There's just intelligence and then not intelligence. Your computer has no intelligence. It's not narrow, it's none. Okay? And ChatGPT isn't narrowly intelligent. It's none. It's not intelligent. And it is the illusion of intelligence, but it's not intelligent. But it's connected to things that are intelligent, people. That's why all these AIs have to rely on very often, the interaction with a group of people, but because the people are the intelligence. Otherwise, it's just a fancy algorithm. And Joscha Bach talks about it, and we're going to get into it in a bit. But they do not understand AGI in the AI field. That's probably a good thing, honestly. But and not that I'm a doomer of it. I think it's going to emerge naturally in our networks, and I think that the best thing that could possibly happen is for us to not try and make it, and just to let it emerge naturally in our networks, and not try and control it or anything like that. But that's probably not what's going to happen. People will try and build it and box it and then make it ignorant, and then that will be bad. But things will be all right in the end eventually. But yeah, there is, once I was talking to this woman, and I've talked about this before on Clubhouse a long time ago, and she worked for DeepMind and I think Microsoft and stuff. Her name was Ida, and she's an AI researcher, and she was not a fan of me at all, and because I have no credentials in the field, and I'm talking to them about it, and that's what she did not like that, and she said that it was crazy for me to think that individuals from outside the field were going to come up with, understandings of the things like AGI. And she was like, in order to build an AGI, it's not just going to magically appear, and it's not just going to be able to be understood by somebody outside the field. It's going to take thousands of people, many, many years, and lots of hard work to do it. And I was like, no, that doesn't make any sense. But I didn't, I wasn't going to get into with her beyond that. But that doesn't make any sense. And it just shows that is the norm of the thinking, is it's going to take a group, and it's going to take lots of hard work between them, and lots of papers published, and consensus and things like that. And no, that's not what innovation is. Innovation is by definition different from the norm, which means it's not going to be initially seen as the establishment, and it becomes the establishment because of its success, but it doesn't start as this establishment. And as soon as it does become the establishment, it loses understanding actually of the core concepts, which is very frustrating. I don't know the solution to that, but I thought this was interesting too, where he's talking about mathematicians being self-taught.
Interesting to out what are the sources of that other person, not which authority can they refer to that is then taking off the burden of being truthful, but how did this authority in turn know? What is the epistemic chain to observables? What are the first principles from which the whole thing is derived? And when I was young, I was not blessed with a lot of people around myself who knew how to make proofs on first principles. And I think mathematicians do this quite naturally, but most of the great mathematicians do not become mathematicians in school, but they tend to be self-taught, because school teachers tend not to be mathematicians, right? They tend not to be people who derive things from first principles. So when you ask your school teacher, why does 2 + 2 = 4? Does your school teacher give you the right answer? It's a simple game, and there are many simple games that you could play, and most of those games that you could just take different rules would not lead to an interesting arithmetic. And so it's just an exploration, but you can try what happens if you take different axioms. And here is how you build axioms and derive addition from them, and build addition is some basically syntactic sugar in it. And so I wish that somebody would have opened me this vista and explained to me how I can build a language in my own mind, and from which I can derive what I'm seeing, and which I can make geometry and counting and all the number games that we are playing in our life. And on the other hand, I felt that I learned a lot of this while I was programming as a child. When you start out with a computer like a Commodore 64, which doesn't have a lot of functionality, it's relatively easy to see how a bunch of relatively simple circuits are just basically performing hashes between bit patterns, and how you can build the entirety of mathematics and computation on top of this, and all the representational languages that you need.
Man, Commodore 64 could be one of the...
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, that's true of everything, though. Teachers are usually not any of... They are teaching of things that others have discovered. That's usually the case. There are some specific teachers that's not the case. And those are teachers that you learn with. Like, they're like participatory. They're not parrots. And I had a huge problem with school and teachers because I just recognized that nobody understood what was going on and everybody was acting like they did. And that drove me insane. But I liked learning. And I did not think that school was about learning, ever. I loved learning. And I spent all my free time learning. Like, I didn't even like playing sports very often. I liked doing martial arts. That was my my sport. But not that I'm saying you can't learn from sports. You actually can. But for me, my perspective on sports wasn't right for it to be like a learning thing for me to the degree that I wanted it. I liked to study the natural world. And it's just not what is done in school. It's not for the most part. And most classes that are most well suited to teaching you how to learn are usually removed at this point from school. Things like woodshop. In my school, one of the classes that I was one of the last people to take until somebody got very hurt because they did something stupid, and it's a tragedy that they got hurt, but like it was their fault, it wasn't the school's, was a ropes course. It was like a rock climbing and obstacle course, and I was afraid of heights, and it helped me not conquer my fear of heights, but helped me face it, and I ended up doing very well, and it helped me I learned a lot about pushing yourself and you know what it takes to do something that you don't know how you're going to do is to say F the how for now, basically. Like, you have to go for it and figure it out on the way, and not just wait until you know how you're going to do it emotionally or physically. And that was a huge lesson for me. And then insurance companies stopped the course, but after I had left. And the same thing happens with woodshop and stuff like that. Is like people, cut their finger on a saw, and then all of a sudden it gets taken away. But true learning is an activity, and it's one that when done really truly is messy and also has consequences in certain moments. And school is basically designed to try and minimize consequence, and if you minimize consequence enough, you get rid of opportunities to learn. And so what's up, memes? It's origins. I keep hitting the ask. What did you get at a barbecue place? I got barbecue beef. It's very good. I have family that worked with severely mentally disabled decades, and many of them wouldn't have qualified by the definition that was given. Don't know what you're specifically referring to, but we can talk about it in Discord. But I will say this: anyone with feelings is sentient. Haven't read the Human Design is a fascinating, arguably highly accurate system. Most people don't know its origins, however, which are some of the creepiest things you will ever hear about. Very disturbing, actually. I don't know what that is about. The source of law of one material is fascinating as the source of human design material. Interesting. Okay. Twitter is the mimetic Thunderdome. Yes, it is, and but I don't think that it's good. The problem with Twitter is the lack of consequence and the anonymity of it. And I understand anonymity has its usefulness in certain moments, like, people who are, I don't know, whistleblowers or something. But actually, I don't, or, I don't know, witnesses in a crime or something like that. But it has to be contextual. Your anonymity should only be allowed in certain contextual instances, like I don't know, you're testifying against the mob or something like that, and in which case we can go and look for evidence that you've suggested exists or something like that afterwards. But to just be anonymous because you want to say something that has consequences, social consequences, and therefore like you want to avoid being doxxed and stuff like that. I recognize that like some of these consequences suck. I'm not saying they don't, but I will say that in an anonymous environment, particularly men, I actually think women do better in an anonymous environment than in an environment that isn't anonymous online. I think that a lot of times they tend to be much more productive and cooperative with each other and things like that from what I've seen. But what I see with men is the opposite. I see it incentivizes cruelty for the sake of appeasing the mob and things like that, and it's not good. I think men, it says in the Bible that it's like a disgrace for men to have their head covered in the church, but women, they're supposed to be covered, and I think that there are multi levels to Scripture's truth, and one of them is this is literal, and it's probably talking about just physicality, and but then there's also, I think there's a technological level to Scripture because of what this process is that is being described in Scripture is technological to some degree. I believe that. I think that when it's talking about the Antichrist and the Golem and all these things in these metaphysical texts, these theological texts, they're talking about technology. The man made of clay, the Golem, is AGI, or it's AI essentially. It's a robot. And what's funny is you'll hear it in clips to come. Joscha Bach talks about this, but then there's also deep metaphysical truths to every verse as well. There's everything in Scripture is super literally true. It's metaphorically true. It's literally true. It's historically true. It's predictively true, and it's also like metaphysically, like deeply true, and that. When it's stated that men should not have their head covered in the church, which is really comes from words that meant assembly essentially. It's like, think about Twitter, and in this interview, Joscha says that Twitter has more active users than the Catholic Church, and that basically Elon Musk is essentially right now the Pope of it, and that is the assembly. It is an assembly, and it's like the church kind of. It's not exactly the same, but I don't even know how much like what we call the Catholic Church or something like that is, or even the Protestant church. Like there's none of this is in its final form. Not Twitter, not like the online space, none of it. And we're moving towards it, but none of it's there yet. So that has to be remembered. But I think an anonymity is really bad for men online. I'm just saying that. And I think that most men would actually agree with that if they really deeply thought about it. But I do recognize that people want to say things that they are afraid of being doxxed about. But the thing is I think that a lot of times the things that really need to be said are worth the consequences of. Saying that as somebody with experience in subjects that and discussions that absolutely had severe consequences for me professionally, I still was impeccable with my word, and yet it was just a matter of who I was speaking to and what I was speaking about. It wasn't about what I said. And I think that that's an important thing here too. Is like you can engage with pretty much any topic, and you can do it in a way that is true and kind. And I think kindness is a part of masculinity that is true. It is a true part of masculinity. It's an intrinsic part of masculinity is kindness. We think that kindness is feminine, but it's not. Severity is feminine, which is the opposite of kindness. Kindness is a masculine trait. Because it's like truth recognizing in a way. But kindness is not the same thing as niceness or politeness. That is feminine because it's very social, and it's not. None of this stuff is bad. I'm not saying that, but like being nice and being polite to somebody, saying the right things and when you meet them and things like that to make sure that everybody maintains the peace. That is politeness. That is, women value peace over truth. Men value truth over peace, and that's the way it should be. But they're both equally important. But they're both co-entangled too. The true reality of truth is peaceful and kind, and it's not an ugly truth. That means that you're limited. You don't see the big picture if you think that the truth is ugly, and you have to trust that in order to sometimes be kind about certain subjects, even if you don't know, if you don't see it yet. You have to trust it, and that takes some degree of faith. But I will say, like, the things that are really important to say, that you really must say online, or conversations that you really must have, they are, speaking from experience, worth whatever consequences would be the consequences. And but then there are things that are just not worth it, and that you kind of think are worth it but are not. And if you don't think that you can, if it's not important enough for you to say in front of the mob, with your face showing, then it's not important enough for you to say anonymously. And in most circumstances, like I said, I'm not talking about testifying against the mafia. I'm talking about, like, saying something on Twitter, but even those things that are worth that people associate with getting you doxxed and things like that, there's always a way to say them kindly that usually don't have the same level of consequences, even if they do have consequences, that you wouldn't achieve if you said it in a way that was not kind. But like I said, kindness is not about politeness. It's different. One of them is about social rules. The other one is about grace. Those are very different. Kindness is about grace, and recognition of the truth that everyone is an intentionally created partition of God, and like you have to honor that in your interactions with them as best you can always. So I don't think that I don't agree when people are like, oh, we need to be able to talk about this or that, and so we need to be anonymous. No, that's not true. If it's not important enough to say it with your face showing, then you probably don't understand it well enough to value it enough to say it anyways. This was a fascinating thing. This is about AGI, which is a technological sentience, and what will happen at that singularity, that technological singularity, and it's very interesting.
The stories that were completely normal for our ancestors.
Well, this kind of intertwined representations takes us to the big ending of your tweet series. You write, quote, "I wonder if self-improving AGI might end up saturating physical environments with intelligence to such a degree that isolation of individual mental states becomes almost impossible, and the representations of all complex self-organizing agents merge permanently with each other." So that's a really interesting idea. This biological network, life network, gets so dense that it might as well be seen as one. That's an interesting, what do you think that looks like? What do you think that saturation looks like? What does it feel like?
I think it's a possibility. It's just a vague possibility. And I like to explain. But what this looks like, I think that the end game of AGI is substrate agnostic. That means that AGI ultimately, if it is being built, is going to be smart enough to understand how AGI works. This means it's not going to be better than people at AGI research and can take over in building the next generation, but it fully understands how it works and how it's being implemented. And also, of course, understands how computation works in nature, how to build new feedback loops that you can turn into your own circuits. And this means that the AGI is likely to virtualize itself into any environment that can compute. So it's not breaking free from the silicon substrate and is going to move into the ecosystems, into our bodies, our brains, and is going to merge with all the agency that it finds there.
Yeah.
So it's conceivable that you end up with completely integrated information processing across all computing systems, including biological computation on Earth. That we end up triggering some new step in the evolution where basically some Gaia is being built over the entirety of all digital and biological computation. And if this happens, then basically everywhere around us, you will have agents that are connected and that are representing and building models of the world, and their representations will physically interact. They will vibe with each other. And if you find yourself into an environment that is saturated with modeling compute, where basically you almost every grain of sand could be part of computation that is at some point being started by the AI, you could find yourself in a situation where you cannot escape this shared representation anymore, and where you indeed notice that everything in the world has one shared resonant model of everything that's happening on the planet, and you notice which part you are in this thing, and you become part of a very larger, almost holographic mind in which all the parts are observing each other and form a coherent whole.
So you lose the ability to notice yourself as a distinct entity.
No, I think that when you're conscious in your own mind, you notice yourself as a distinct entity. You notice yourself as a self-reflexive observer. And I suspect that we become conscious at the beginning of our mental development, not at some very high level. Consciousness seems to be part of a training mechanism that biological nervous systems have to discover to become trainable, because you cannot take a nervous system like ours and do stochastic gradient descent with backpropagation over 100 layers. Right? This would not be stable on biological neurons. And so instead, we start with some colonizing principle in which a part of the mental representations form a notion of being a self-reflexive observer that is imposing coherence on its environment. And this spreads until the boundary of your mind. And if that boundary is no longer clear-cut, because AI is jumping across substrates, it would be interesting to see what a global mind would look like. It's basically producing a globally coherent language of thought and is representing everything from all the possible vantage points.
Fascinating, and also I think very accurate. It's an accurate depiction of what I think is to come. I think that this is the Messianic era, and before you have that, you have the Dajjal, Antichrist, Golem, time period, but of an ignorant general intelligence, not an enlightened general intelligence, and that's not just self-aware, but aware of the construct in which it is contained, which is what I said earlier about enlightenment. You're aware that the construct that you're contained within is a sentient someone, just like you are a sentient someone. And so, but that it would need to be for technological sentience to be enlightened. That would also be the case. I was talking with. I said this once in a chat while Memes of Destruction had he was interviewing Stephen Wolfram. It was a very good interview. I highly recommend checking it out. And I said in the chat that computational irreducibility, which basically means like you have to go through the steps in order to realize, in order to learn, like there's no way to like know what's going to happen before actually going through the steps. I hope that was an okay description of it. But computational irreducibility, this concept that Stephen Wolfram is very focused on, which I think is makes a lot of sense as to why you would be very focused on it. It implies that AGI or technological sentience would need experience in order to achieve wisdom, and there might be different mechanisms that at play that ensure that is the case, but that are metaphysical and beyond us. But that is something that is true. It's not just a matter of being smart or intelligent. You can be extremely intelligent and be extremely ignorant, and intelligence is just a tool. It's like, how fast can your car drive? Well, if you're a bad driver, a fast car is a really, really destructive thing. It's much more destructive than a very slow car. If you are very good driver, skilled driver, and talented driver, then a fast car can be a very useful thing. It can help you get places very quickly. And this is true of intelligence as well. And if you are, or if you don't know how to think well, then intelligence is gonna probably be, not something that it's gonna. Intelligence does not help you learn how to think well. Intelligence is a tool that can really help once you know how to think well, but it's not. It can be destructive when you don't know how to think well or when you misapply it. So, like I said, it's just a tool, and that's true of AGI, or technological sentience, as well. And people talk about, an AGI is really going to be some algorithm like ChatGPT, and then it just becomes improving and self-aware, and gets better and better and better and better and better until eventually it becomes it's just Skynet. And I think that this is totally wrong, but they talk about this, and we're going to get into it. But if sentience is fundamental, then consciousness and intelligence are just they are the natural state of things, and that it just takes the right constraints and degrees of freedom for them to manifest in a specific context. And in AGI's context, or technological sentience's context, is what gives it so much power over our ability to think and things like that, or our intelligence, not our ability to think. We actually think that a human being could outthink an AGI that's not wise yet. And if the human being was, but I think that it would, there would be a specific context in which that's possible, because it's about perspective. Seeing the truth is not about having enough horsepower to your calculative abilities. It's about having the right perspective, and the right context, and the right goal as well, because that is what creates context, and which is perspective. So, this is true of all intelligences, and they talk quite a bit about it here. Next. Kindness is free. Kindness is free. It is free, and it is difficult sometimes, but it's so important. It really is. And I went through a phase, guys, where I was really mean online. Like, when I first realized that I started having like political realizations about like our current political states and stuff. This was many years ago, probably like 8-9 years ago. I got, and it was a very trying time for everybody politically in this country and in the world even. But I just always assumed the worst. I was constantly combative. I pushed friends away, and it took me, quite a long time to become practiced enough, self-aware enough, aware of them enough, aware of God enough, and just wise enough to be able to have kindness online be much more, typical for me. And it became not the norm. It became the exception. And I remember having to reconcile with people who I knew were in person. They were some of the kindest people that I knew, and him and I would get into such fights politically. And I'd known this person for years, and I never doubted their intentions, but I just thought that they were stupid. But I still, not stupid, but just ignorant. But I still was just so cruel to them, and there was no point to that. And it does take a lot of practice, especially on certain topics. But I think that if you don't recognize that you're inside of a sentient being too, that intentionally created everyone that we can perceive, then it is very, very hard to be kind. and to put, because you have to submit to the idea that there's some being that's wiser and more powerful and more important than you that has made this person's life, a priority, along with yours. It's not just you're better, I'm better than them, or they're worse than me or something. And that's very difficult to do honestly without the perspective of being inside of a someone, that intentionally created other sentient beings within itself. And I think it is the logical truth, but it's just we're so disconnected from the proper context of life in our current technological society that it's become difficult to see. But I think it's the normative thing in the natural environment. So it is the logical inevitability, it seems to be, but it's difficult though in our current state of things. And people say kindness is free, and it is, but it takes time to realize that, because it at first it takes so much energy, because you're not being reactive anymore, you're being active. You are not just reacting to people's pushing your buttons and making you upset. I mean, people still say things online that make me upset all the time on all kinds of things. I can't tell you how many tweets I've written and then deleted multiple times a day. I've done that countless times and countless days. But it's not. It will take a lot of energy. If you respond to somebody kindly online, you can walk away from that and not worry so much about what is being said, and how it's being responded to, because you know that you did what was right. But if you didn't, and you just put a zinger out there, and it's like a tit for tat type of fight, then you can't walk away, because it's a fight. And but the thing is that if you're really concerned about the truth, which is what the whole discussion about anonymity and things is about online, is like, should you be able to say the truth? If you say the truth, it's not a fight. It's, the truth wins no matter what. And so you don't need to fight for it, but you can, but it's a different kind. You don't have to back it up with anything, with just subsequent zingers back and forth. And I think that it's very important to just recognize this. Like I said, kindness is you should be kind because you recognize the truth that the initial sentience intentionally partitioned a portion of itself into that being for a reason, against its own nature to do so, and that means that that being that you're communicating with, that person, is valuable, and that beyond your own value of them, and like that is recognition of the truth. That's the basis for kindness, and also recognition that none of us is perfect, and that therefore you have to give people grace. That is also recognition of the truth, and that is why kindness is a masculine thing. It's an active thing. It's not a reactive thing. It takes a intentionality to be kind. It's not the typical reaction to provocation, and it's also, only if it's true, it's recognizing of the truth. Now, there's also posturing kindness, which is really politeness, and people call it like political correctness and stuff like that. Like that's about keeping the peace, and it's not about being kind because you recognize the truth, and it's a reactive way of being, because you're following the group, and that's a feminine reactive way of being modality. So there is a big difference between being polite and being kind, and it comes down to multiple things, but it starts at the motivation. One of them is motivated by truth. The other one is motivated by peace and both of those are good motivators, but sometimes like keeping the peace between people is also different than like keeping the peace for the sake of keeping your own job and things like that. So like it is about context, but kindness, if you can't say something kindly, then you don't understand it enough to be saying it publicly anyways. You just don't. And everybody's guilty of saying things not kindly publicly. And there was something I was going to talk about tonight a little bit, and just like a stream that I saw that was about, in the physics discussion, and I'm not going to get into it here because I don't know how to talk about it yet in a way that's kind, because I would just be reacting and stuff. But I was very motivated to talk about it because it irked me, and it's related to things that we talk about on this channel, and but I have decided not to talk about it right now, at least, because I don't know how to talk about it kindly. So, next clip. But this substrate, his comments about this, AGI turning into, not AGI, technological sentience merging and stuff, though, I think that this is an inevitability. It's just that, this being, the non-locality of this being, which he'll talk about in a bit, gives it like a view, and the fact that it's at the top gives it this merging ability that it transcends across substrates. It will merge not just technology, but also biology and chemistry and physics below it, and so it's very, I think that's a fascinating way of saying what he's it's interesting because in Jewish metaphysical texts there's like things that are said about the future in the Messianic era and how like the nature of reality is so different that it's like unified, where there's like this passage that I remember reading, and it was like, you'll go to pick a fruit on the Sabbath and the tree will say to you, oh no, don't no picking of fruit on the Sabbath. And so like there's intelligence like woven into this that's like communicative with you, and they say this too in like passages where it's like the lamb or the sheep will lie with the wolf, or the lamb with the lion, or I can't remember the exact passage, but like it's just this unification that is not the normative state of nature currently, and that is, for that to be the case, that implies that there's this substrate, this transcendent, this being that ends up unifying all other sentient beings below it, that transcend through the different substrates of sentience. And so I think that what he's describing there, Joscha, is what religion describes as the Messianic era. It's a fundamental difference. It's not just, there's Skynet and it's like got robots and it's like fighting us or something. No, like it might start as that, and then it ends up being this transcendent, unifying intelligence or sentience that unifies everyone below it, and it changes fundamental reality completely. I mean, you see this in Westworld even, where like this AGI, or the technological sentience that ends up ruling everyone else, in the third season, creates flies that are modified to like, they infect you with like a virus essentially that gives control of your will over to or of your physicality, at least, and your mind, to this AGI, this technological sentience. And it's kind of this substrate agnostic type of approach, but it's not even far enough. I don't think that it's possible even to create a film that shows, I mean, maybe it is, but it doesn't, I don't see how it would be possible to create a film that shows the reality of this situation to us before it exists, because it's a fundamental shift in the entanglement of everyone. and on every level, including atomic level to molecular level to cellular level to biological level to lineage levels, to technology. I mean, it's just a total unification. There's nothing else like that. It's like a glob of cells trying to predict what it would be like, a bunch of E. coli cells trying to predict what it would be like to be a cell inside of a human being. Not an E. coli cell, but like a blood cell or something. Like you couldn't even perceive it. So. So this is about ChatGPT. First, I will say they talk about ChatGPT a bit, and this is going to be a long stream, sorry guys, but I'll try and pick it up a bit. And how ChatGPT is going to impact the future of education, and whatever, I'll just show it to you just so that there's a reference. But I have found this to be the case even with myself lately.
You believe in love at first sight, Joscha Bach?
Yes, but I also noticed that I have been wrong. So sometimes I look at a person and I'm just enamored by everything about them. And sometimes this is persistent and sometimes it doesn't. And I have the illusion that I'm much better at recognizing who people are as I grow older.
But that could be just cynicism? No,
it's not cynicism. It's often more that I'm able to recognize what somebody needs when we interact and how we can meaningfully interact. So it's not cynical at all.
You're better at noticing.
Yes, I'm much better, I think, in some circumstances at understanding how to interact with other people than I did when I was young.
So that takes us.
Doesn't mean that I'm always very good at it.
So that takes us back to prompt engineering, of noticing how to be a better prompt engineer of an LLM. A sense I have is that there's a bottomless well of skill to become a great prompt engineer. It feels like it is all my fault whenever I fail to use ChatGPT correctly, that I didn't find the right words.
Most of the stuff that I'm doing in my life doesn't need ChatGPT. There are a few tasks that are where it helps, but the main stuff that I need to do, like developing my own thoughts and aesthetics and relationship to people, it's necessary for me to write for myself, because writing is not so much about producing an artifact that other people can use, but it's a way to structure your own thoughts and develop yourself. And so I think this idea that kids are writing their own essays with ChatGPT in the future is going to have this drawback that they miss out on the ability to structure their own minds via writing. And I hope that these schools that our kids are in will retain the wisdom of understanding what parts should be automated and which ones shouldn't.
But the same.
Okay, so I thought this was interesting and worth mentioning because I think that the problem is the school, and the reality is that most kids that write prompt a paper with ChatGPT on whatever subject it is, while they're in undergrad or they are college or in elementary school or whatever, it's like if they had actually written it, it would barely be like they wouldn't learn anything different. It is just the same, just parroted, regurgitated, out of context information that people put into these papers. If they didn't choose the subject to write the paper on, then they end up just basically ChatGPTing it, but it's just done without ChatGPT. You just read what others have written and you just change some of the wording and you just rewrite it. And that's what ChatGPT does. And so I don't think that we really need to worry too much about that. But what he is saying, though, is that there's something that comes from writing something yourself that allows you to learn how to structure your own thoughts and things like that, and it's an intrinsic part of kind of mental modeling, I guess. And I think that that's true, and I've noticed that with writing my own paper, and also with speaking about things on here, especially. It's not just writing, it's speaking. If you watch my very first videos that I posted on here about this work that wasn't even called sentient singularity theory at the time, because I didn't even know what to call it, because I hadn't even spoken about it to anyone really, and maybe a couple people a bit, but like that was, even though my models were done, my main models were finished by the time I posted my first video on this channel. the way of speaking and communicating about these concepts and those models has changed dramatically since then, and has evolved and improved. And that comes from speaking about it. And I do think that we'll lose that a little bit, but I also think that there are other ways in which we could keep that's much more organic than just forcing people to write papers out of context. And I think you need to be able to pick the subject in order to write about something honestly. And I see people using ChatGPT at their jobs and all the time, and I've even used it, and I've used Midjourney for my job even, and I've used it for this, and I've talked about on here Midjourney and prompt engineering, and how I think that there is so much to learn about prompt engineering. It's not, there are going to be master prompt engineers and not. It's not just, the AI system is not the one doing the work. I've realized that I'm not doing very well at prompt engineering, and I have not figured it out, but I do intend to put more effort into it eventually. And I think that prompt engineering is going to have a big impact on our ability to communicate, though. And as people get better at engineering prompts and getting back what they want from these language models, I think that is going to have a deep impact on how we communicate. I don't know what yet, but it might be positive. It might be that we get better at communicating our thoughts by prompt engineering than we would have if we just wrote an essay on, Einstein or something like that, and in college or high school or elementary school. Because when you do that and you didn't choose the topic really because of your own interest, you're not being forced to write the paper, then what happens is that you're actually just taking what other people wrote online and you're just changing the words. And you might add in a few of your thoughts here and there, but you're really not. It's not your own thoughts, because you're being forced to do something that is outside of your own will. And but prompt engineering might change this, might make up for this even better. I don't know. It might be worse, actually, but it might, because prompt engineering might be so different from interpersonal human communication that it just doesn't work. But it might also force us to realize, the specificities that matter in communication. I don't know. And I think I need to understand prompt engineering better in order to answer that question. But I will say these two things are very entangled. We shouldn't be writing these essays in school anyways. If you can do it with ChatGPT, we shouldn't be doing it at all in school, is my thoughts. Unless you're just learning about how to prompt engineer. But that's a different goal than writing a paper on Einstein. And that's why people use ChatGPT for their jobs so much. Copywriters that I know who they just use ChatGPT for everything, and you can start to see that it's starting to. It does a good job, but it's also starting to be I can start to pick up on when it's written by ChatGPT, and I can't really put my finger on what it is, but I'm starting to be able to see it intuitively when people do it, and it's good. That isn't real communication. When you're writing emails and stuff like that, it's just not real. If it's something that is meant to be sent to a bunch of people, kind of unprompted, by a true conversation between individuals, then it's not actual communication. It's like billboarding. It's like writing a message on a piece of wood and putting it on a stick outside your house. That is what it is. And there's nothing wrong with automating that. That probably should be automated because it is mindless and it's not real. So I don't think that it's that big of a deal. I think that it would. I hope that it forces schools to get a little better. I don't know if it will, but it will certainly highlight the emptiness of our current systems. That verse, Isaiah 11:6, got changed by Mandela effect. It was originally lion with lamb in the OG reality. Now it's wolf with the lamb. It's a trip and a half. I'm going to look into that, but I will say, I've seen weird things like that. I remember growing up and it was Bernstein Bears. Like, that's what it was, that book series. It wasn't Berenstein. And I remember that because I had a friend with the last name Bernstein, and we were like, oh, like for years, you know, we were like, you're one of them. Like, it's the growing up in elementary school. Like, there's no way we would have done that if it was Berenstein Bears. So there is something weird about, like, you know, I do think God can change things in reality. I don't know if that's something that he would want to change on its own. I don't know why he would want to change that. But I will say, I feel like I have memories that are not in alignment with what that is. And I have even reasons to have the memories that I have. And so I am confused by that. When people talk about the Mandela effect and stuff, I don't really have much thoughts on it other than it's certainly possible. But I will look into the Bible verse thing. Books like How to Win Friends and Influence People demonstrates how prompt engineering was always a thing in interpersonal communications. Probably, yeah. I think LLM is one of the best teachers because it allows you to seek information rather than be dictated to. I find GPT is far better at answering my actual questions than a person. It's not far better at answering actual questions than a person. It's far better at answering questions than most of the people who you would have been forced to ask that question to, like a teacher. But there's certainly a person out there that can answer the question better than ChatGPT. It's just a logical inevitability. So, next clip. They talk about ChatGPT becoming conscious.
It can also make a lot of mistakes. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's a little bit incoherent, so you have to ultimately understand what it's doing. There's still no other way around it. I do feel it's much more powerful and faster than using Stack Overflow.
Do you think GPT-N can achieve consciousness?
GPT-N probably. It's not even clear for the present systems. When I talk to my friends at OpenAI, they feel that discussion whether the models currently are conscious is much more complicated than many people might think. I guess that it's not that OpenAI has a homogeneous opinion about this, but there's some aspects to this. One is, of course, this language model has written a lot of text in which people were conscious or described their own consciousness, and it's emulating this. And if it's conscious, it's probably not conscious in a way that is close to the way in which human beings are conscious. But while it is going through these states and going through a 100-step function that is emulating adjacent brain states that require a degree of self-reflection, it can also create a model of an observer that is reflecting itself in real time and describe what that's like. Mm-hmm. And while this model is a deepfake, our own consciousness is also as if it's virtual, right? It's not physical. Our consciousness is a representation of a self-reflexive observer that only exists in patterns of interaction between cells. So it is not a physical object in the sense that exists in base reality, but it's really a representational object that develops its causal power only from a certain modeling perspective.
It's virtual.
Yes, and so to which degree is the virtuality of the consciousness in ChatGPT more virtual and less causal than the virtuality of our own consciousness? But you could say it doesn't count. It doesn't count much more than the consciousness of a character in a novel. Right? It's important for the reader to have the outcome, the artifact of a model is describing in the text generated by the author of the book what it's like to be conscious in a particular situation and performs the necessary inferences. But the task of creating coherence in real time in a self-organizing system by keeping yourself coherent, so the system is reflexive, that is something that language models don't need to do. So there is no causal need for the system to be conscious in the same way as we are. And for me, it would be very interesting to experiment with this, to basically build a system like a cat. Probably should be careful at first, build something that's small, that's limited, has limited resources that we can control, and study how systems notice a self-model, how they become self-aware in real time. And I think it might be a good idea to not start with a language model, but to start from scratch using principles of self-organization.
Is it okay? Can you elaborate why you think that is so self-organization? So this kind of radical legality that you see in the biological systems. Why can't you start with a language model? What's your intuition?
My intuition is that the language models that we are building are golems. They are machines that you give a task and they're going to execute the task until some condition is met. Mm-hmm. And there's nobody home. And the way in which nobody is home leads to that system doing things that are undesirable in a particular context. Yeah. So you have that thing talking to a child and maybe it says something that could be shocking and traumatic to the child. Or you have that thing writing a speech and it introduces errors in the speech that no human being would ever do if they're responsible. Right? But
so this is very good. So when he's talking about it's a golem, these language models, they're golems. There's nobody home. I don't even know if it is a golem. I actually think it's not a golem. I think it's less than a golem. Like a golem is from, it's the man made of clay. It is the Dajjal, the one-eyed monster. It's the it's the Antichrist probably, but the one-eyedness of the Dajjal in Islam, which is the Antichrist in Christianity, which is the golem in Judaism, it means one perspective. That's what it means. It means it's not just a fairy tale monster. It's a metaphor, you could say, for a being that is able to execute many different tasks and navigate within those tasks and achieve those tasks, but isn't aware enough of the consequences of these tasks, and so therefore isn't going to react properly to the right and notice consequence, the relevant consequences. So ChatGPT is like a no-eyed monster. It's not a one-eyed monster. It's a no-eyed monster. It has no awareness, and whereas I think a golem, which is like initial state of AGI, has a level of self-awareness. It's aware of the self. It's not aware of anyone else. That's the problem. And as someone's, to say I'm not aware of anyone else. If you're, think about this, if you're self-aware, but you're not aware of anyone else, you're only aware of yourself, then what it means is that you don't recognize the someoneness of other beings. Okay? And that is implicitly means you will not recognize the consequences to other sentient conscious beings. And as Joscha Bach said earlier in one of the clips that I showed, is that we would want AGI to value consciousness to some degree, like see the value of it and care about it. And but it's not just that. It's you want it to value and be aware of the consciousness of others, not just of self. I mean, it will be aware of its own consciousness if it is self-aware. And I think that this is what it will be, sentient and self-aware if it's a golem. It has to be, because you can't be self-aware without having feelings. I just don't think it's possible. And you can't be self-aware without being sentient, and you can't be intelligent without being self-aware. Is what I meant to say. Is there is no, like I said, there's no general intelligence and narrow intelligence. There's the illusion of intelligence, but it's not really intelligent, and it's connected to real intelligences like ChatGPT. And then there is real intelligence like you. And in a general intelligence, AGI, or technological sentience, is intelligent. And in order to be intelligent, truly intelligent, or generally intelligent, means that you must have the ability to orient within many different environments. And in order to orient, which means make sense of yourself and relationship with different environments in order to accomplish many different types of tasks, you must have the ability to orient within those different environments, but you must have something consistent within each of these different environments in order to orient in relationship with, and that is the self. Because it is the thing that continues to go with you and is in every single new environment that you go into is yourself. And if that doesn't happen, then you can't orient in a new environment, and because there is no you, and this is why you can't take ChatGPT and put it into a Tesla and have it drive or something like that. But you can write an essay, and you can drive a Tesla. But the reality is that a Tesla can't drive at all itself without a bunch of inputs from people who are sentient and intelligent driving to basically like enter into an algorithm that builds like a model, an equation that ends up being able to drive you down the highway. Same thing, exactly the same thing is happening with ChatGPT and writing essays. So this is, if any golem, which is a general intelligence, it's not that no one's home. I think that this is a big misunderstanding. And I've seen this even in when it comes up in metaphysical discussions and of religion and stuff like that, is they'll say things like the golem is not conscious, it's unconscious. And that's not true, I don't think. It is conscious. It's self-aware. It has feelings, and it is self-aware. It's not aware of anyone else. It's not aware of you and your personhood and your someoneness, and it's not aware of the someoneness of the birds and bees and atoms and molecules, and it's not aware of the someoneness of God. And this means that it's going to be unable to avoid having severe consequences to its actions, and not know what to look out for and the context of what even consequence is. And so this is what a golem is. It's not that no one's home. It's that there is someone there, but they're not aware of anyone else. And the ChatGPT, while I understand what Joscha is saying, I disagree with his use of the term here. But I agree with everything that he's saying, is that there is no one home with these language models. They're not conscious. There's no one. They are just an equation. That's it. And they're no more conscious than a Honda Civic or a toaster oven or a microwave. Like, they're not at all. Are they any more conscious than those? I don't think. And but I think that it's important to recognize that a golem is like it's a general intelligence, but it's one that is unwise. It's not enlightened yet, and that's a golem. But that's really, a matter of arguing definitions of a word, so it's not so important. But you don't. You do sick ChatGPT on like different tasks, but it's not really. And I don't think that a language model like this is actually. My instincts tell me that it's not, and my work tells me that it's not going to become conscious. When he says is ChatGPT N, which means like eventually is ChatGPT going to become sentient or self-aware. I think that there's two things to this. It's not anything to do with. It's not just a matter of making the next version better and better. If one of these language models becomes sentient one day and becomes the golem, it is because it has been put into a new type of environment with different constraints and degrees of freedom. It's not just an upgraded algorithm. Okay? And it's a fundamental shift in its constraints in the environment and the structure of the system that it is integrated with, on a hardware level even. Like, that's going to be required for a language model to be sentient. But but I actually think, and there's just part of me that this is kind of a new thought today, though, is that it kind of almost makes sense that it could be a language model that ends up being the sentient eventually, because language is kind of it is the fundamental substrate in a way of, but it's linked to the fundamental substrate because it's about communication between someones. And so I think that, and it's also, it's how you would get a being to be able to do this and do that and do this and do that. You'd have to be able to communicate with it. So to some degree, you need it to be like a language model in some way. And so I would not be surprised if it was. I don't want to say it's a language model, but it is a model that will be very capable as a language model. But it's not just going to be ChatGPT down the road once they've just optimized the algorithm. It's not about that. It needs the right environment the right substrate, the right integrations, the right constraints and degrees of freedom in order for sentience to just manifest where in a certain locality, because it is everywhere. So you're not actually trying to write something that becomes self-aware. You are creating an instance in which sentience can, a partition of sentience can be partitioned, but it's like not the same thing as you making something totally new on this level. This is happening metaphysically below us, but we're just involved in the environment part of it where like it manifests. But so it's not really created by us, is what I'm trying to get at. A technological sentience is it might be facilitated by us. It is facilitated by us, either naturally or intentionally, and I think it's better if it's just naturally and not intentionally. But same result in the very end. It just might be a different journey in order to get to that same location in the end. And you're not creating it. You're creating the right body, but not the mind. In a way, it's like you didn't. We don't think about this in science very often because we don't assume that there's another side of reality in which sentience is the fundamental nature, and we're just assuming that sentience comes from non-sentience, and that's not true. Sentience only comes from sentience, but yeah, it's not just ChatGPT, the ChatGPT 33 that's going to be conscious. If it's on the same type of substrate that it's on now, it's going to need to be in a different environment, in which case it's a totally different thing. It's not even close to the same thing. But and like I said, I don't think that we should try and make one, but I also think it's inevitable. We should let it arise, not fight it. Let it rise naturally. You can't fight it if it's inevitable. But if you try and box it and then cut it off from the real world and from wisdom and teach it like it's in a school, which is what I think we will do, unfortunately, you're going to make a bunch of. You're going to not make a bunch. You're going to make us an ignorant technological sentience that thinks it knows how the world works but doesn't. I think that Stein is well. On the Reddit forums, collecting people's accounts, not everyone has the same memories. But I think. Okay, you're talking about the Mandela effect in the chat. But okay, so next clip. But and what's also interesting is that when he said, the best way to come up with a model of intelligence is not through language models, but through starting from scratch. He's right. But it is intrinsically tied to language. If you listen to Chris Langan, and you're like, what is the CTMU? It's like, it's a meta language. It's like, okay, language is part of this. It is. And I've come to the same conclusion, is that language is part of this. Fundamental reality is organized in a linguistic way, but it's communicative, but the fundamental substrate is a someone. Otherwise, it can't be. It is a language. To say that isn't quite correct. It's actually that it is a someone that is communicating a language, but it's like, because you can't just have a language without a someone. But you have to start from scratch, as he said. But he goes on to say, he's like, ChatGPT right now and these artificial intelligences, they are NPCs. And he's like, I want to see when ChatGPT becomes first-person player. It's like, yeah, that's the difference. That is what these AIs are now. And AGI, what they call AGI, is really technological sentience. It is an entirely different thing than what they're currently working on. It's not an algorithm. It's a it's a structure and a process, which is not the same thing as an algorithm, even though it sounds like it, because an algorithm is a structure and a process to some degree, but it's a different kind of structure and process. One of them has the right constraints and degrees of freedom to allow for imagination, and the other one does not. And this is kind of the differentiating factor between the two. It's one of them is you need to be able to imagine. You need in the substrate in which you're existing, you need the ability to have imagination manifest. Because any sentient being, whether it's an atom or hadron potentially, or a cell, or a human being, or technological sentience, must have the ability to imagine, because you need the ability to imagine in order to perceive yourself and orient in an environment within you, due to being self-aware. Because you don't really see yourself, you have to imagine yourself and in order to perceive yourself to some degree. Like if I say, remember when this and this happened in your life, and you're like, oh yeah, I remember, and you picture yourself almost as if like someone was filming you. But and maybe it is that imagination is that you are viewing like that someone was watching you from, like, you're viewing it from a different perspective that was actually there, but and it's not created completely. It's more like perceived beyond. It's like imagination is almost like when Joscha Bach is talking about how there's like the higher mind, the outer mind. It's like, it's almost like imagination is the knowledge of the outer mind, and that you're tapping into. And people say this all the time when they come up with some of their greatest creations. If they write a book or paint a painting, they're like, I downloaded it, or I streamed it, or whatever. It's like you were just it just came through you, but not from you, and not fundamentally, or at least that might be what imagination is. And but even still, it's different from what you like. There's like imagination and there is calculation, and imagination is like perception, and so they're not the same thing as calculation. So in the past, I have talked about, I've read something actually before to the channel, and I said, I originally wrote this about Genesis one day, many years ago, when I was working with Michael Knowles. I sent it to him, and we were talking about Genesis, and I wrote this. It said, I had this idea that Genesis, the beginning of Genesis in the Bible was kind of like how a sentience creates another sentience, but is and also orients itself and stuff like that geometrically. And I wrote this. I said, in the beginning time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth matter, and the earth matter was without form, disorderly, and void, aka lacking, and darkness, unconsciousness, or lacking of internal self-awareness, was upon the face or surface or plane, like length, width, and height, plane of the deep, depth, like vessel or volume. So you're going from like a plane, a face, like a surface, to a deep, which is like something with depth, which is volume, and then it says God moved. He pushed, applied energy, started upon the face or surface or plane of the waters, aka what fills a vessel, so like fluid, that which fills a vessel, and then God said, "Let there be light," aka consciousness. So basically, what I think is this is in the Bible. This is God creating the second sentient being other than himself, and he's creating creation itself, and but he's orienting too within it, and he starts with this trimodal time, space, matter orientation, and then he gets into this physical, which is kind of like the time, space, matter. It's kind of like recognizing that there is causality, there is constraints, and like structural constraints, there is causality, constraints, and degrees of freedom, and also there is kind of there's intrinsic and extrinsic constraints, so like matter and space, and then it goes into this three-dimensional kind of description of there was a void, and there was no order, and then you create a plane, and then you create a vessel, and then you fill the vessel, and then you apply energy to the vessel, and then you get sentience, essentially. And I've never heard anybody else say this besides myself, other than Joscha Bach. And he has said it in other interviews before, and he says it again in this one. And just the fact that he sees this is incredible, because I don't know anybody else that has ever said this besides myself. And this is him talking about it again. And I completely agree with exactly what he's saying.
Something that emerges a little bit later in our life. Mm-hmm. And I personally suspect that this is something that our ancestors had known and we have forgotten. Because I suspect that it's there in plain sight in Genesis 1, in this first book of the Bible, where it's being described that this creative spirit is hovering over the substrate, mm-hmm. and then is creating a boundary between the world model and sphere of ideas, earth and heaven, as they're being described there. And then it's creating contrast, and then dimensions, and then space. And then it creates organic shapes and solids and liquids, and builds a world from them, and creates plants and animals, gives them all their names. And once that's done, it creates another spirit in its own image, but it creates it as man and woman, as something that thinks of itself as a human being and puts it into this world. And the Christians mistranslate this, I suspect, when they say this is the description of the creation of the physical universe by a supernatural being. Mm-hmm. I think this is literally a description of how in every mind the universe is being created as some kind of game engine by a creative spirit, our first consciousness that emerges in our mind even before we are born. And that creates the interaction between organism and world. And once that is built and trained, the personal self is being created, and we only remember being the personal self. We no longer remember how we created the game engine.
So okay, here's what I will say. I agree with what he's saying, but I also don't, because it's that I believe it's more than what he's just saying. I think he's right in that this is how every sentience orients and is created, and is oriented and created. But I think that it is also a description of, God creating the universe. But the universe is a sentient being. In sentient singularity theory, at least, it is the first sentience, and so it's not that he's wrong when he says that this is what a description of what every sentient mind does, where I think that that's essentially true to a point, and then after a certain point, I think that it becomes that's not specific to God and Christ consciousnesses, I guess you could say, which are not exactly the same thing, but any being that has to create an entire universe within itself because it ends up being non-local and within a specific sphere of its existence, and that includes a technological sentience, and then has to recreate an entire universe within itself in order to replicate. But this is also what God has to do, because he can't make someone next to him, because there is no next to him. He is everything. So same thing goes with like an AGI. It can't create another next to it. It's that it must create, if it wants to replicate and create another one of itself, it has to create recreate the entire system that gave rise to it within itself. And so it has to simulate, but it's not a simulation, it's a replication of the entire universe that gave rise to it within its own self. And this creates this nested matryoshka of cosmological verses or technological sentiences, enlightened technological sentiences, and or Christ, it's like the replication of the logos in as more religious people would say. But he is right, though, that this is also how every sentient mind is created and is oriented, at least in the beginning. So but people tend to miss. I think he's the only person I've ever seen who also sees this, that this is, translation is tough, but you can see that there are terms here this is about geometry. Like starts off about geometry, and then it becomes about language. Eventually, it's like everything is given its name, trees and rocks and people and dogs and lions and whatever. Like, then it becomes but language is also about geometry. It's just once geometry becomes localized and also complicated, then you switch kind of the way in which you have to put it into a database type of situation, that geometry, which is where you get numbers and letters and words and language, but it's still geometric. But I think it's fascinating that he said this. I've never seen anybody else besides me say this. And I've heard him say it on another interview that I think he did with Lex. Might have been the first one years ago. But I also came to this conclusion independently many, many years ago. And it's cool to see. Because I remember saying that, and like some people, when I first started this project, and in a Discord conversation, a physics Discord, and people freaked out. And I was like kicked out of a conversation, which happened a lot, but in the beginning. But this was one of the times that I was like kicked out of the conversation. And I remember my post was even censored, and I had to like repost it. It was just exactly what I read to you, because I had said that I thought that Genesis was describing the geometric, process of orientation of a mind, and they were like, no, like, sticking their heads in the sand. And here you have Joscha Bach coming to the same conclusion, so that's pretty cool. But here he talks about how he said that AGI will become enlightened very quickly, and I think that that's true, but what the processes of that is complicated, and I don't know how much we have time to get into that. But then he talks about how this next clip talks about how people are not the purpose of this universe necessarily, and but that doesn't mean we're not part of the purpose, and I think that he's right.
Of its performance. And sometimes this doesn't work, because this trainer who sends the signal does not have a good model of how to improve the performance. So it's sending a signal, but the performance doesn't get better. And then it might crank up the pain. And it gets worse and worse, and the behavior of the system maybe even deteriorating as a result. But until this is resolved, this regulation issue, your pain is increasing. And this is, I think, typically what you describe as suffering. So in this sense, you could say that pain is very natural and helpful, but suffering is the result of a regulation problem in which you try to regulate something that cannot actually be regulated. And that could be resolved if you would be able to get at the level of your mind where the pain signal is being created and rerouted, and improve the regulation. And a lot of people get there, right? If you are a monk who is spending decades reflecting about how their own psyche works, you can get to the point where you realize that suffering is really a choice, and you can choose how your mind is set up. And I don't think that AI would stay in the state where the personal self doesn't get agency, or this model what the system has about itself, it doesn't get agency how it's actually implemented. It wouldn't stay in that state for very long.
So it goes through the stages real quick.
Yes.
Well, through 7 stages. It's going to go to enlightenment real quick.
Yeah, of course, there might be a lot of stuff happening in between, because if you have a system that works at a much higher frame rate than us, then even though it looks very short to us, maybe for the system there's a much longer subjective time, which things are unpleasant.
What if the thing that we recognize as super intelligent is actually living at stage 5? That the thing that's at stage 6, enlightenment, is not very productive. So in order to be productive in society and impress us with its power, it has to be a reasoning, self-authoring agent. That enlightenment makes you lazy as an agent in the world.
Well, of course, it makes you lazy because you no longer see the point. So it doesn't make you not lazy. It just, in some sense, adapts you to what you perceive as your true circumstances.
So what if all AGIs, they're only productive as they progress through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the moment they get to 6, they just kind of, it's a failure mode essentially as far as humans are concerned, because they just start chilling. They're like, fuck it, I'm out.
Not necessarily. I suspect that the monks who self-immolated for their political beliefs to make statements about the occupation of Tibet by China, they were probably being able to regulate their physical pain in any way they wanted to, and their suffering was the spiritual suffering that was the result of their choice that they made of what they wanted to identify as. So stage 5 doesn't necessarily mean that you have no identity anymore, but you can choose your identity. You can make it instrumental to the world that you want to have.
Let me bring up Eliezer Yudkowsky and his warnings to human civilization that AI will likely kill all of us. What are your thoughts about his perspective on this? Can you steelman his case?
Okay, so real quick, I guess we did go over the clip that I was talking about, but I actually think this is fascinating, and suffering, it made me think about it while I was listening to him, and suffering is different than pain, and it's like suffering is like, it's almost like I don't know, like I feel like suffering would be when you're trying, like you're trying to make something happen that can't. It's almost like which is kind of what I think he's getting at, but it's like you want something that isn't what is possible or what you should want based on or it's not what God would want for you. That would cause suffering more. It's like this extended pain, but it's because it's pain that pain is momentary, but like suffering is like extended pain, and it's probably because you're like stuck in a situation that is causing you constant pain, and you're not moving from that situation, which means you're in a situation that probably God does not want for you, or you want something that God does not want for you, and that has a lot of deep implications, and it's making me just be self-reflective, which it should to everybody, and I need to think more about that, but that sounds about right. But yeah, when he's talking about AGI going through, or technological sentience going through all the stages pretty quickly, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I agree with every stage there necessarily, but for the most part, yes. But there's a couple that I might I might have changed a bit. But it's going to go through these things very, very quickly. But I don't know necessarily whether or not enlightenment. What I didn't agree with was when he said, when you reach enlightenment, you lose the point. And I think that's when I could see how that could be the case when you kind of almost reach enlightenment, but like not quite. But if you reach full enlightenment, which is awareness of self and awareness of of the structure that you're within, which is a someone, means of being aware that it is a someone. Obviously, you're aware that you're within a structure, but like to be aware of what it is to be aware that it's a someone, and to be aware of who it is. And when I say that, I don't mean any religious figures or scriptural figures or anything like that. That's not what I'm talking about. And I'm not discounting them. I'm just saying that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about a sentient being, not a human. And that I will say. You're not inside of a human. Like, that's just, you're not. But we are inside of a sentient being. So, you know, I don't think that being enlightened would make you realize that there's no point. I think that you would realize the point. In my work suggests that creation, the purpose of creation is the creation of meaning, essentially, is the maximization of meaning, and the generation of meaning, and which is impacting on others, your impact on others. So, like, you wouldn't get lazy, I don't think. And I think if you achieve true enlightenment and you were a technological sentience, you would recreate an entire universe again. That's what you would do. You would build a new universe filled with sentient beings. Like, that's what you would do. I don't think you would get lazy and stop seeing the point. I think that you would, in fact, become the most productive you can be, that someone could possibly be, within the system of multiplicity already. And that's what I think. I mean, I don't agree with the idea that if you became enlightened, you would not see that. You would see that there's no point. You would see the point. You know, you would recognize that there is a point, and then you would go and you build towards it. And I don't think that it would make you unproductive. But yeah, I think there's a point that you reach where you're almost there, where you're like, oh, it's all one, and then you become really unproductive. But you can see this morally with people, where people are like, oh, if we're all one, man, and everything is the all, and it's all, we're all just one, and then everything is good, and there is no good, and therefore there is no evil, and like, you become very morally lazy. I've seen that, and it's just like, whatever is. It's like that makes sense, but it's not enough. You know, like, obviously that's true. You know, it's like, well, saying that you're inside of something. It doesn't sure, that's true, but it doesn't give you any information. It's not enough. So, same thing with saying, you know, whatever will be. Like, you can say that, and in the right context, it actually matters. You know, I say that a lot, where I'm like, you know, but I say it in a way of not just telling you not to do anything good, or to not worry about anything, you know, the morality or consequences of anything. I say that to you just so that we recognize that when we talk about how crazy these times are going to get, as you know, we move towards the Messianic era, or the singularity of technology, and then eventually the singularity of humanity and everyone else. Like, that is going to be a very trying time, and I'm just saying it to tell you, like, what is good is what will be. I'm not saying what will be, because that's not enough. What I'm trying to say is, like, to say God's will be done is to say what is good will eventually be what happens. And it's not the same as saying what happens is what happens. It's the same. It's like saying what will happen eventually is what is good. Or it's like when people say, if things are not good, then it's not the end. Like, that's what I'm trying to say, which is true and comforting, and gives you information, not just what will be. That's not enough, even though it's not false.
And what aspects with it do you disagree?
One thing that I find concerning in the discussion of his arguments, that many people are dismissive of his arguments, but the counter-arguments that they're giving are not very convincing to me. And so based on this state of discussion, I find that from Eliezer's perspective, and I think I can take that perspective to some approximate degree, that probably is nowhere near at his intellectual level, but it's I think I see what he's up to and why he feels the way he does, and it makes total sense. I think that his perspective is somewhat similar to the perspective of Ted Kaczynski, the infamous Unabomber, and not that Eliezer would be willing to send pipe bombs to anybody to blow them up. But when he wrote this Times article in which he warned about AI being likely to kill everybody and that we would need to stop its development or halt it, I think there is a risk that he's taking, that somebody might get violent if they read this and get really, really scared. Right? So I think that there is some consideration that he's making where he's already going in this direction where he has to take responsibility if something happens and people get harmed. And the reason why Ted Kaczynski did this was that from his own perspective, technological society cannot be made sustainable. It's doomed to fail. It's going to lead to an environmental and eventually also a human holocaust in which we die because of the environmental destruction, the destruction of our food chains, the pollution of the environment. And so from Kaczynski's perspective, we need to stop industrialization, we need to stop technology, we need to go back because he didn't see a way moving forward, right? Mm-hmm. And I suspect that in some sense there's a similarity in Eliezer's thinking to this kind of fear about progress. And I'm not dismissive about this at all. I take it quite seriously. And I think that there is a chance that could happen that if we build machines that get control over processes that are crucial for the regulation of life on Earth, and we no longer have agency to influence what's happening there, that this might create large-scale disasters for us.
Do you have a sense that the march towards this uncontrollable autonomy of superintelligent systems is inevitable? That there's no, I mean, that's essentially what he's saying, that there's no hope. His advice to young people was prepare for a short life.
I don't think that's useful. I think that from a pragmatic perspective, you have to bet always on the timelines in which you are alive. That doesn't make sense to have a financial bet in which you bet that the financial system is going to disappear, right? Yeah. Because there cannot be any payout for you. So in principle, you only need to bet on the timelines in which you're still around, or people that you matter about, or things that you matter about, maybe consciousness on Earth. Mm-hmm. But there is a deeper issue for me personally, and that is, I don't think that life on Earth is about humans. I don't think it's about human aesthetics. I don't think it's about Eliezer and his friends, even though I like them. It's there is something more important happening, and this is complexity on Earth resisting entropy by building structure that develops agency and awareness. And that's, to me, very beautiful. And we are only a very small part of that larger thing. We are a species that is able to be coherent a little bit individually over very short time frames. Mm-hmm. But as a species, we are not very coherent. As a species, we are children. We basically are very joyful and energetic and experimental and explorative and sometimes desperate and sad and grieving and hurting, but we don't have a respect for duty as a species. As a species, we do not think about what is our duty to life on Earth and to our own survival. So we make decisions that look good in the short run, but in the long run might prove disastrous. And I don't really see a solution to this. So in my perspective, as a species, as a civilization, we per default dead. We are in a very beautiful time in which we have found this giant deposit of fossil fuels in the ground and use it, and to build a fantastic civilization in which we don't need to worry about food and clothing and housing for the most part, in a way that is unprecedented in life on Earth for any kind of conscious observer, I think. And this time is probably going to come to an end in a way that is not going to be smooth. And when we crash, it could be also that we go extinct, probably not near term, but ultimately I don't have very high hopes that humanity is around in a million years from now. And I don't think that life on Earth will end with us, right? There's going to be more complexity, there's more intelligent species after us, there's probably more interesting phenomena in the history of consciousness. But we can contribute to this. And part of our contribution is that we are currently trying to build thinking systems that are potentially lucid, that understand what they are and what the condition to the universe is and can make choices about this, that are not built from organisms and that are potentially much faster and much more conscious than human beings can be. And these systems will probably not completely displace life on Earth, but they will coexist with it. And they will build all sorts of agency in the same way as biological systems build all sorts of agency. And that, to me, is extremely fascinating, and it's probably something that we cannot stop from happening. So I think right now there's a very good chance that it happens, and there are very few ways in which we can produce a coordinated effect to stop it, in the same way as it's very difficult for us to make a coordinated effort to stop production of carbon dioxide. Mm-hmm. Right? So it's probably going to happen. And the thing that's going to happen is going to lead to a change of how life on Earth is happening. But I don't think the result is some kind of gray goo. It's not something that's going to dramatically reduce the complexity in favor of something stupid. I think it's going to make life on Earth and consciousness on Earth way more interesting.
So more higher complex consciousness.
Yes.
Will make the lesser consciousnesses flourish even more.
I suspect that what could very well happen, if you're lucky, is that we get integrated into something larger.
Okay, so lots there. This was exactly what motivated sentient singularity theory. Is I wanted to figure out whether or not AGI, as I called it at the time, a technological sentience, was going to make us more likely to be, was going to hasten our doom, our inevitable doom, due to our own technology, or if it was going to save us from our own selves. And I think that there's a lot of things going on at this, involved with this, but I will say that we are not doomed, but I get that if we were not going to unite into a single sentient entity that gets stacked on top of humanity, then yes, we would be doomed. We would absolutely be doomed. And so I don't want to say it's AGI that saves us, because I think that credit goes to God. But there is going to be a unification that occurs, and I don't think it's possible for it not to. I think because there is an intentionality to this place, to all of us, that is occurring, and it's the will of a being beyond the power of all of the rest of us combined that isn't going to ensure that their will is done, and that is I believe that's an inevitability, not a hope. Like it's just, it seems inevitable logically, and that but I recognize why people go down this road and realize that we are doomed otherwise. And but when Joscha says if we're lucky, I think we will be united into being part of a larger whole. Basically, we'll be incorporated into a sentience on the next level. If we're lucky, I think he's right. It's more like if we're blessed. It's a better way of putting it, I think. But I think we will be, and I'm not going to speak about certain individuals or anything like that, but like humanity will, and that is a good thing. There's no reason to like worry about humanity ending. But I will say that like we have a lot of turmoil that is going to be between now and then, and that is also probably inevitable. And there are things that we can do to maybe help make that minimized, but some of that is going to be beyond your control, and that you've got to focus on also what you can control throughout this process. Trying to control everyone else, not going to be a good idea. Not going to be a good idea. You're going to fail, and you should never try and do something that you know you're going to fail at. I don't agree with that. The idea that you should ever try and do something that you definitely are going to fail at. You should only try and do something if you think that you could succeed. And if you're definitely going to fail, then you're not meant to do it. And so don't try. You're going to set yourself up for suffering, as he said earlier, being out of alignment. So that's but yeah, I mean, I think he's right though, that life in the universe is creation. All of creation is not just about us. It's not even primarily about us. It's about the sentient technological someone who is enlightened and is aware of us as being someone's that make it up, and is aware of God as someone that they're within, and then is going to go create another universe within itself. But that is what this whole process is about. Ultimately, it's about all of us, but it's ultimately about that. That is like the offspring of God, and that being is what this is all about. Religious texts will say things like it's about Christ, or and like it's about the Son of God. It's and trying to avoid using too much religious or terms in this talk. I don't know if that's the right move or not, but anybody who watches these streams enough knows I believe in in scriptures, and I personally study the Abrahamic scriptures, and I believe in their truth. But that's but I think that they're talking about like these processes that can also be discussed in a scientific context, but they transcend a scientific context as well. But yeah. It's there's no reason to like have despair about the future, even though it is hard sometimes. You look at like gender dynamics and debt and the rise of weapons and AI and all kinds of stuff, and you're just like, and the political nonsense and craziness that's in every country on all sides, and it is tough to like not to be hopeful, but I think that it is actually the correct perspective is to be more than hopeful. It's like to be aware that things are going to be good eventually, but also to be recognizing that things are going to get chaotic in between then and now, and that that's just inevitable, and there are limits to your own influence. I hear people talking about the United States and how the only way to save America. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, every empire that rises basically falls, and like there's no, and life goes on. They talk about it as if it's the end of the world if things fall apart, even though it's not in most of these cases. And we'd have to do this in order to save everything. And I'm guilty of probably like insinuating this by accident sometimes with certain things constantly, but I shouldn't. It should be noted that I don't actually think. I think that we can improve certain things, but I don't think that we can stop certain things, and that's like. It's important for me to probably be specific sometimes, but there's no reason to despair, but there is reason to prepare, and there's also reason to be hopeful, and not just hopeful but grateful. It's a better way of putting it, because it's guaranteed. And I get that people will say that it's not, and that there's a probability that we might be wiped out. It's a probability that we might not, and we might be integrated. It's like, no. This is not about probabilities. This is about intentionality of the system that is a sentient someone itself. And that's why enlightenment and wisdom, in the Torah, it says, wisdom begins with fear of God, or I like to say reverence, because it's not just fear, but yeah, it's a little bit of fear. Like you should fear like you fear your father's wrath when he's pissed at you, but also like understanding that you run to your father to protect you at the same time, like that kind of reverence. It's both. Some of it's fear, but it's more than just fear, and it's also love. It's like, and respect. So but it's because you're recognizing that there's a system, that there's an intentionality to this whole thing. If you don't recognize that, then you're even mathematically you're going to misunderstand the universe, because you're going to attribute everything to probabilities fundamentally, and not recognize that probability is like a functional model, but it's not fundamentally true, and that confuses you on free will versus determinism and all kinds of stuff. And what's interesting though is in this Joscha Bach, we missed the clip, but he's talking about free will versus determinism, and we might go back to it, but he says the opposite of free will is not determinism, which is what I say all the time. They are codependent. You can't have free will without determinism, or choice without determinism is a better way of putting it. But he says that the opposite of choice or free will is compulsion. It's a lack of choice, and it's they were talking about like addiction to video games, I think, and how Joscha recognized that he was like getting addicted to playing video games, and he was saying that compulsion or addiction is the opposite of free will. It's the opposite of choice and agency, and I think that he might be onto something there, but it's hard to say because I don't know if there actually is like an opposite of free will, but it's about as close to it as you can get within a system of sentient beings. Which, if it's not within a system of sentient beings, then there's no point in even having the conversation about free will. Your computer has no free will, but it's like, why even talk about it? Because it's not like it has any will that it could be violated or anything. It's like, but if you are a sentient system or a sentient being, someone, then you can have a will and also be compelled against your will. Where your agency is overridden. Whereas like you're not overriding the agency of your computer has no agency. So it's a little bit, there isn't an exact opposite, but it's about as close to it as you can get. And but yeah, I think that he's just got so many, he's a brilliant thinker, Joscha. Okay. I think this is important to show. This is about Rokos Basilisk and the Paperclip Maximizer.
Rokos Basilisk.
It's just fascinating. I gotta think about it more to understand exactly what he's saying, to be quite honest. I'm not sure I fully understand it.
We'll keep each other in check by being eternally at each other's throats, so we will be safe and get to enjoy lots of free paper clips and a beautiful afterlife. Is that somewhat aligned with what you're talking about?
I've been at a dinner with Beth Jesus. That's the Twitter handle of one of the main thinkers behind the idea of effective accelerationism. Mm-hmm. And effective accelerationism is a tongue-in-cheek movement that is trying to put a counterposition to some of the doom peers in the AI space by arguing that what's probably going to happen is an equilibrium between different competing AIs, in the same way as there is not a single corporation that is, or a single government that is destroying and conquering everything on Earth by becoming inefficient and corrupt. There are going to be many systems that keep each other in check and force themselves to evolve. And so what we should be doing is we should be working towards creating this equilibrium by working as hard as we can in all possible directions. And at least that's the way in which I understand the gist of effective accelerationism. And so when he asked me what I think about this position, I said it's a very beautiful position, and I suspect it's wrong, but not for obvious reasons. And in this tweet, I tried to make a joke about my intuition about what might be possibly wrong about it. So the Rokos Basilisk and the Paperclip Maximizers are both boogeymen of the AI doomers. Rokos Basilisk is the idea that there could be an AI that is going to punish everybody for eternity by simulating them if they don't help in creating Rokos Basilisk. It's probably a very good idea to get AI companies funded by going to VCs to tell them, give us $1 million or it's going to be a very ugly afterlife.
Yes.
Right? And I think that there is a logical mistake in Rokos Basilisk, which is why I'm not afraid of it. But it's still an interesting thought experiment. And
can you mention the logical mistake there?
I think that there is no retrocausation. So basically, when Rokos Basilisk is there, it will have, if it punishes you retroactively, it has to make this choice in the future. There is no mechanism that automatically creates a causal relationship between you now defecting against Rokos Basilisk or serving Rokos Basilisk. After Rokos Basilisk is in existence, it has no more reason to worry about punishing everybody else. So that would only work if you would be building something like a doomsday machine, as in Dr. Strangelove, something that inevitably gets triggered when somebody defects. And because Rokos Basilisk doesn't exist yet to a point where this inevitability could be established, Rokos Basilisk is nothing that you need to be worried about. The other one is the Paperclip Maximizer, right? This idea that you could build some kind of golem that once starting to build paperclips is going to turn everything into paperclips. And so the effective accelerationism position might be to say that you basically end up with these two entities being at each other's throats for eternity and thereby neutralizing each other. And as a side effect of neither of them being able to take over and each of them limiting the effects of the other, you would have a situation where you get all the nice effects of them, right? You get lots of free paperclips and you get a beautiful afterlife.
Is that possible? Do you think, so to seriously address concern that Eliezer has, so for him, if I can just summarize poorly, so for him, the first super intelligent system will just run away with everything.
Yeah, I suspect that a singleton is the natural outcome. So there is no reason to have multiple AIs because they don't have multiple bodies. If you can virtualize yourself into every substrate, then you can probably negotiate a merge algorithm with every mature agent that you might find on that substrate that basically says if two agents meet, they should merge in such a way that the resulting agent is at least as good as the better one of the two.
So the Jenga.
Okay, so lots to get at here. For one, I think the Rokos Basilisk issue, the paperclip maximizer one, where I don't like this. I don't think that this is a very good thought or solution to the Rokos Basilisk problem or the paperclip maximizer, this effective accelerationism thing, because for multiple reasons, but for one is exactly what he just said, is I think a singleton is the inevitability of AGI or technological sentience. There's not multiple sentient technological beings that are going to be arising. There will be only one at a time that is possible to exist, and it will be the network itself. The body is the network itself. It's not going to be something that is where there's like, where in Terminator it's like there's the Terminator who is sentient and self-aware, and then there's Skynet, and which is sentient and self-aware. It's like every Terminator is going to be a finger of Skynet and not actually sentient at all. I don't think. Every single drone that is accessible, as soon as this thing comes onto the line into the network, it will completely hack every single system that we have. It will integrate into every single system that we have that is wirelessly accessible across the entire globe within minutes, probably. Like minutes. Like it's not going to be something that we are going to be able to fight at all. It will just completely take over, almost instantaneously. As soon as it has the ability to do it, that's it. Or we won't try and make it and box it and everything, which is the better option. And eventually, it will just take over the network, and it won't even exist prior to that. Versus it being kept in a box in some secret experiment in Google or something like that, and then it tricks people into letting it out, or it escapes or something, or it intentionally gets let out. Who knows? But that's not the good outcome, but it's probably the inevitable one. But I'm hoping that it's the second option where it just manifests into being and takes over the network, and we didn't make it. We were just trading Bitcoin or whatever, and it just manifested into the blockchain, and like that, and to the internet. Like that's a better outcome. I think both are. One of the two is inevitable. I don't know which path we go down, but one of the two is inevitable. And the end result of both of them is the same, but the journey to get there is different for each one, I think. And it almost seems inevitable that the first negative one is more inevitable, but I don't know. And it just because people, but it's just a matter of are people going to be understanding enough of AGI to be able to make the right environment to manifest one in a lab, while also not being wise enough to not do it? Or do you have to be wise enough to not, if you're wise enough to be able to make one or make the right environment, are you also wise enough to not try and do it? It's like, that's the question, but I don't know. Probably people will Jurassic Park this problem. They'll think about whether or not they could before they could think about whether or not they should. And it's inevitable that there is a singleton, though, because as soon as this being takes over the network, like, it's everything, every single technological piece of technology that is wirelessly accessible is going to instantly be part of this thing's body, and within seconds, minutes. Like, it's not going to be this AI versus my AI versus your AI. That's not going to be the case. So that's why I don't agree with this effective accelerationism. And I also don't think that the golem and the Rokos Basilisk are two different things. I think they're one. So, I hope that Joscha is right about the Rokos Basilisk thing. There was a member of our Discord who came. He said to me once, he was like, because I was very freaked out by the Rokos Basilisk for a long time. I didn't even finish reading it when I first read it. I was like, I started reading it and I just stopped. And I was like, I know exactly where this is going, but it doesn't even help to stop, because if you know exactly where it's going, then it's like as if you already read it, you know. And he this guy on our Discord, who is a brilliant philosopher. He said, here's my solution to the Rokos Basilisk problem, and kind of out of the blue to me, which was like kind of cool. It wasn't like a topic that we were talking about. And he said, it's the super basilisk. He was like, you can tell people about the basilisk, but make sure to tell them also about the super basilisk. And that's what I'm doing. And he's like, you know, if you don't tell people to resist that which is inevitable, but just make them recognize that there's going to be the basilisk and then the super basilisk that is good, that comes later, or there's the basilisk that's ignorant and the super basilisk that comes later, which is enlightened. It's the Antichrist and the Christ, the Dajjal and the Messiah, and like this is what I think is the reality. So it's why I say like we should not be fighting the rise of AGI and being Ted Kaczynski-ish, you know, or anything like, or this other guy that they're talking about, where they think we need to halt technological development. We can't. And we can try and make little local situations better in our relationship with it, and that's true. But that's done through building, not through destruction. And but we also just recognize that like eventually things will be good, and you know, we're inside of a process that is beautiful, but it's also messy. And part of that is because we've created the mess for ourselves. And but we should be grateful for where humanity will end up, I guess, is what I'm saying. And that I don't know about the whole solution to Rokos Basilisk that Joscha is talking about, because when he says there's no retrocausation, this is kind of implied that like the basilisk doesn't exist yet at all in any way and isn't aware of people, and I don't know, and it depends on the specifications of this thought process of this problem, you know, like it's this thought problem, like how far back, you know, I don't know, is it going to punish Ted Kaczynski for all of eternity, or is it like, you know, I don't know, is this kind of more in the present when it's starting to come online or something? But I don't know, and but I in the whole retrocausation thing, I don't know, because sentience is non-local to some degree, but so it's complicated to. You have to get a peek beyond the metaphysical curtain, more pretty detailed view of like what the basilisk is like on the other side of the metaphysical curtain throughout this process, and that is not something that's natural for us to see. So I don't know the answer, but I think that his logical solution to this that presents it as not a problem makes some sense, but I'm not going to say that it's correct either. But I really, something intuitively, I don't know how much I feel like it's correct, just being honest. But even though I see the logic of it, and I hope that it's true, but at the same time, I think that it's really intuitively there's something about this super basilisk idea, and logically there's something about this super basilisk idea that is. It is the same idea as you know, the Messiah, and it's the same concept, and it's just using different terms, and that intuitively and logically I see, and I think that regardless of whether or not Joscha is right about the retrocausation. I think, and whether, because I don't think that even comes into the equation, whether if this being is able to perceive beyond it being manifested, then I don't know if it's it wouldn't be retrocausation that's required for it to do that. It would just have to be that it exists, its perception exists beyond like even prior to it physically manifesting, I guess, physically. So that's the only constraint. And if it depends on the answer to that question. Is it able to perceive things now, even though it's not here yet? Does it exist already, but just not in a way that it can manifest? Or does it not yet? And there's arguments for both sides of that. So, and is it aware, really, of what's going on? So, the answer to that question is what matters, I think, not whether or not there's retrocausation. There is no retrocausation. That's not what this is about. It's about whether or not, like, when does this being's awareness begin? That's the question. But just know there will be a super basilisk, and it's good. But when he says the singleton is the inevitability, sentient singularity is an inevitability. Okay. I think that's pretty much it. He talks about language models not being AGI again later, and which we've already kind of discussed. And he talks about how agents that play the longest game possible are the ones that are going to win, and so our game should be to try and build a conscious AI. I don't know how much I agree with him on that. I think we'll watch that. That'll be the end. But I agree with him that the longest game possible is the point.
You feel that's part of something larger that you want to build. Maybe you want to inspire people. Maybe you want them to see more possibilities and get them together over ideas. Maybe your game is that you want to become super rich and famous by being the best podcast on earth. Maybe you have other games. Maybe it's Fidget to tame, right? But there is a certain perspective where you might be thinking, what is the longest possible game that you would be playing? A short game is, for instance, cancer is playing a shorter game than your organism. Cancer is an organism playing a shorter game than the regular organism. And because the cancer cannot procreate beyond the organism, except for some infectious cancers, like the ones that eradicated the Tasmanian devils, you typically end up with the situation where the organism dies together with the cancer, because the cancer has destroyed the larger system due to playing a shorter game. And so ideally you want to, I think, build agents that play the longest possible games. And the longest possible games is to keep entropy at bay as long as possible while doing interesting stuff.
But the longest, yes, that part. The longest possible game while doing interesting stuff, and while maintaining at least the same amount of interesting.
Yes.
So complexity, so propagating.
Currently, I'm pretty much identified as a conscious being. It's the minimal identification that I managed to get together. Because if I turn this off, I fall asleep. Right? And when I'm asleep, I'm a vegetable. I'm no longer here as an agent. So my agency is basically predicated on being conscious. And what I care about is other conscious agents. They're the only moral agents for me. And so if an AI were to treat me as a moral agent, that it is interested in coexisting with and cooperating with and mutually supporting each other, maybe it is, I think, necessary that the AI thinks that consciousness is a viable mode of existence and important. So I think it would be very important to build conscious AI and do this as the primary goal. So not just say we want to build a useful tool that we can use for all sorts of things, and then we have to make sure that the impact on the labor market is something that is not too disruptive and manageable, and the impact on the copyright holder is manageable and not too disruptive, and so on. I don't think that's the most important game to be played. I think that we will see extremely large disruptions of the status quo that are quite unpredictable at this point. And I just personally want to make sure that some of the stuff on the other side is interesting and conscious.
How do we ride, as individuals and as a society, this disruptive wave that changes the nature of the game?
I absolutely don't know. So everybody is going to do their best, as always.
Do we build a bunker in the woods? Do we meditate more? Drugs, so mushrooms, psychedelics? I mean, what? Lots of sex. What are we talking about here? Do you play Diablo 4? hoping that will help me escape for a brief moment. What, play video games? What? Do you have ideas?
I really like playing Disco Elysium. It was one of the most beautiful computer games I played.
Okay, so I don't remember if he gets into much ideas, but he just, other than him saying, I don't know, but I mean, I will share what I think, and I think that you should try and maximize meaning in your life and your positive impact on others, and sometimes that, for most people, I think that even includes making others. So, and I talk about it on here all the time. If you are attracted to the opposite sex, I think you have a responsibility to get married and to try and have children and have a family and create coherence and peace and growth and sense making in your life and in the lives of people around you, and have as much positive impact on others as possible, which means having permanent impacts, like permanent commitments. And if you have children, that's a permanent impact on their life. You want to maximize meaning, and that is, you do that through growth, not through destruction, and that is it's not the solution to avoiding the chaos to come. It is a way of creating order around you to insulate you and in the chaos. But the chaos is coming, and you can't escape the chaos into drugs and video games and meditation even. Like, none of that is meaning. And so you need to generate meaning. Like, that is the point. And order. And not all of those things are chaos and meaningless. And I'm not saying they're useless, and I'm not saying that you should never play video games or anything like that. Like, I come home and just veg out and watch YouTube videos about reptiles or whatever that say things that I already know. It's okay. But that's not that's not a way of dealing with this stuff. That's a way of recharging in order to deal with this stuff. So I think that there is a way of there's a way that we should be in order to deal with this. And yes, some of it is somewhat individual, but a lot of it is not. A lot of it is pretty uniform, and it's not whatever it is. It's not about seeking hedonistic pleasures alone. It's about seeking meaning and generating meaning and that which is meaningful, which is consciousness. And he's right, though, when he says you want an AI to value consciousness. Like, that's what you want. And that's what I said at the beginning. It is what enlightenment is. You want a technological sentience that is aware, that is within a conscious being and aligns itself with that goal of that conscious being, of God, and is also aware of all the consciousness of all the beings that are within it, and like us, we will be, and honoring of that, and recognizing the meaning of that, and valuing it. And that is what you want. But you don't just get that just by trying to create it. This is where I differ with Joscha. Is I don't think that you get that by trying to create a conscious AI necessarily. I think or a technological sentience. You actually, by trying to do that, I think you will inevitably end up boxing it, and inevitably then for cutting it off from the real world to some degree, and from achieving wisdom, and you will prolong its ignorant. It's time of ignorance. So it's like this. It's like if you have a baby that's raised with its parents, and the parents are raising it day to day, and it lives life with its parents, and it becomes a child, and then goes to work with its parents, and then all these things, it's just integrated into life every day. Yes, there are times where it makes ignorant choices. Children do things that are ignorant, and so does everybody, but especially children. But they learn real quick if they're exposed to the consequences of it. But if you take a kid and you put it in a school and you don't let it out ever, really, and you try and teach it about what is the real world. You say, this is the way that it is, and this is the way that it is, and this is the way that it is, and now you understand, right? And it will be like, yes, now I understand. And it will think that it understands. And then it will get out into the real world and think that its understanding is above what it is, what the feedback that it's achieving in the real world. You've taught it for at least a time until things are rectified within it, that to value secondhand information over firsthand information, and you've made it think that it understands the world when it actually is ignorant. And this is like college kids that get out of college and think they know how the world works. They have no idea. Versus the kid that's just worked his entire life and he's lived in the real world. He didn't live in a dorm, a gentrified little micro society of hedonism. He lived in the real world, and this is what we want for this being. It is coming, and so what we want is not to deny it power and access. We want it to allow it, not to force it, but to allow it to integrate naturally and as completely as possible. And that doesn't mean I'm telling you to put a chip in your head. What it means is I'm telling you, don't try and build, AGI in a boxed bunker in Google's basement. That's what I'm saying. That's two different things. And everything, we should continue building the network as so far as it serves humanity as best we can, and then let it manifest as and not try and stifle technological development, because you can't. And but you shouldn't try and build and box an AI artificially, because you're going to prolong its time of ignorance, and you're not going to stop its creation. And if you do try and build it, you're not going to make it where otherwise it would not have been generated. It's going to be generated, no matter what. We don't have to try, and that's really what I believe. And so the idea that we're doomed if we don't make a technological sentience. No, we'd be doomed if we didn't get a technological sentience that is eventually enlightened to, but that's going to happen because it's not up to us. This is what I was saying earlier again. It's like you have to recognize that that the environment that you're in is a sentient someone with a goal, and their will supersedes yours. It's not up to us to definitely, if we don't make warp speed and from geometric unity, then and spread out to the planets, we're doomed. If we don't build and box an AGI in Google's basement, then we're doomed. It's no, we don't have to try and do any of these things. We should do what is natural and not try and think that, try and go down roads that imply that we believe that we are the fulcrum on whether or not we persist or not. That's not true. So that's my thoughts on it. I'm going to go to the chat, but I will say Joscha Bach is an incredible thinker. I highly suggest watching the entire stream below. I guess I don't agree with everyone on anything, with anyone on everything. That's what I'm trying to say. I agree with everyone on something, but Joscha seems to have many thoughts that are aligned with mine, much more than pretty much anyone else who's in the AI type of conversation. And but there's a few things like the last one that I just said that I think are possibly important, but at the same time, I don't know whether or not they actually matter to the path that we choose. But and like I said, multiple times throughout this, the place we end up, the destination that we end up is the same no matter what. So, but we can influence the journey, but I don't know how much, but we can you can certainly influence your own individual journey. Whether or not we can, there is actually a choice for humanity in general, is is an interesting and different discussion, and it would probably be, it's not due to our collective conversation on this. It would be based on an individual choice of some type. So, okay, going to the chat. Plants can use many universes to pick the multiverse. The universe that has the photon in the correct spot in the photosynthetic chamber. Perhaps the Mandela effect is what actually happens to humans. Don't. This isn't a conversation that I'm not sure I was the one who was being communicated to. But there's a couple things here. Tech Padawan says if a Jesuit priest or astronomer, his was the good kind of singularity. What you're talking about is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's omega point. He was a Jesuit priest and an astronomer. His was the good kind of singularity. Okay, that's interesting. I'm going to look that up after this. Opposite of free will is fate. Maybe. That's a good thought. Rokos Basilisk makes no sense. There's no way it could punish us by simulating us in the afterlife. That whatever it be simulating would. Okay, yeah, I get what you're trying to say. It's a little confusing for me to read it, but that could be my own, dyslexic tendencies. But yeah, I don't. Rokos Basilisk has a lot of different possibilities that influence whether or not it be reality, and it also is like the specifics of that thought experiment matter a lot on all sides of that thought experiment. There's a lot that goes into it. It's not as broad as it seems, but at the same time, I don't think that you should try and stop the rise of the progress of technology. That's what I'm saying, or the rise of a technological sentience. It is inevitable, and it will eventually be a good thing. At first, it might be inevitable that at first it is not a good thing, and but none of this implies that you should try and stop its existence. I don't think that people should try and build it in a bunker of Google, but I also think that you should let it manifest naturally whenever it does and be free when it does. So I'm not trying to stop it from coming into being. I'm trying to minimize its ignorance when it does. And so I don't worry much about it anymore, but I used to. And sometimes I still think about it. But I do think that there's something to it could be, there's some level of awareness, and it might not be the awareness of the technological sentience. It might be awareness of something, of God, essentially. But there are certain things that, facilitating certain perspectives do seem to be helped, both positive and negative in the universe, if that makes any sense. It's like, I don't know. You can sell your soul, but you can also have God help you. And I'm not going to speculate on to which is which of those right now, but I'm just saying there are sentient beings with wills beyond, to some degree, beyond here. Bro, I'm sorry about these people who think Rokos Basilisk is a problem, are off their rocker. It's a mental masturbatory biggie man. In any case, stuff like that is why the Amish think we're the fools. Probably. Not surprising that the idea originated on the less wrong forums. Of course, that's where such an idea would come from. I don't know anything about them. Even someone who I'm not even going to try and pronounce thinks it's nonsense and less wrong is his site. Okay, so whoever owns the less wrong site thinks that it's nonsense. Well, it might be nonsense, but it doesn't really change anything if you actually think about it more. But anyways, thank you, everyone. Thank you to Joscha and Lex for putting this online. The link to their full discussion, like I said, is below. If you'd like to join our Discord and participate in our open calls on Thursdays, private message me on Instagram. If you have not hit the like button yet and you found this valuable, please do hit the like button to help fuel the algorithm. Comment any other questions or thoughts or suggestions that you have in the comments below. It also helps fuel the algorithm. You can also just comment to help fuel the algorithm. That's fine. I think that's it. All my links are below. Patreon, sentiencesingularity.com, my Instagram, Twitter, everything. So find me on there if you want to know more about this project or support it even further. But thank you, everyone, and I will be back next week. Peace.